This is section 31 of The Gilded Age. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Gilded Age, A Tale of Today by Mark Twain and C.D. Warner. Chapter 31. She, the gracious lady, yet no pains did spare to do him ease, or do him remedy. Many restoratives of virtues rare and costly cordials she did apply, to mitigate his stubborn malady. Spenser's Faery Queens. Mr. Henry Brierly was exceedingly busy in New York, so he wrote Colonel Sellers, but he would drop everything and go to Washington. The colonel believed that Harry was the prince of lobbyists, a little too sanguine, maybe, and given to speculation, but then he knew everybody. The Columbus River navigation scheme was got through almost entirely by his aid. He was needed now to help through another scheme, a benevolent scheme in which Colonel Sellers, through the Hawkinses, had a deep interest. "I don't care, you know," he wrote to Harry, "so much about the negroes, but if the government will buy this land, it will set up the Hawkins family, make Laura an heiress, and I shouldn't wonder if Beriah Sellers would set up his carriage again. Dilworthy looks at it different, of course. He's all for philanthropy, for benefiting the colored race. There's old Balsam was in the interior, used to be the Reverend Orson Balsam of Iowa. He's made the riffle on the Injun, great Injun pacificator and land dealer. Balaam's got the Injun to himself, and I suppose that Senator Dilworthy feels that there is nothing left him but the colored man. I do reckon he is the best friend the colored man has got in Washington." Though Harry was in a hurry to reach Washington, he stopped in Philadelphia, and prolonged his visit day after day, greatly to the detriment of his business both in New York and Washington. The society at the Boltons might have been a valid excuse for neglecting business much more important than his. Philip was there. He was a partner with Mr. Bolton now in the new coal venture, concerning which there was much to be arranged in preparation for the spring work, and Philip lingered week after week in the hospitable house. Alice was making a winter visit. Ruth only went to town twice a week to attend lectures, and the household was quite to Mr. Bolton's taste, for he liked the cheer of company and something going on evenings. Harry was cordially asked to bring his traveling bag there, and he did not need urging to do so. Not even the thought of seeing Laura at the Capitol made him restless in the society of the two young ladies. Two birds in hand are worth one in the bush, certainly. Philip was at home. He sometimes wished he were not so much so. He felt that too much or not enough was taken for granted. Ruth had met him, when he first came, with a cordial frankness, and her manner continued entirely unrestrained. She neither sought his company nor avoided it, and this perfectly level treatment irritated him more than any other could have done. It was impossible to advance much in love-making with one who offered no obstacles, had no concealments and no embarrassments, and whom any approach to sentimentality would be quite likely to set into a fit of laughter. "Why, Phil," she would say, "what puts you in the dumps today? You are as solemn as the upper bench in meeting. I shall have to call Alice to raise your spirits. My presence seems to depress you." "It's not your presence but your absence when you are present," began Philip, dolefully, with the idea that he was saying a rather deep thing. "But you don't understand me." "No, I confess I cannot. If you really are so low as to think I am absent when I am present, it's a frightful case of aberration. I shall ask father to bring out Dr. Jackson. Does Alice appear to be present when she is absent?" "Alice has some human feeling, anyway. She cares for something besides musty books and dry bones. I think, Ruth, when I die," said Philip, intending to be very grim and sarcastic, "I'll leave you my skeleton. You might like that." "It might be more cheerful than you are at times," Ruth replied with a laugh, "but you mustn't do it without consulting Alice. She might not like it." "I don't know why you should bring Alice up on every occasion. Do you think I am in love with her?" "Oh, bless you, no. It never entered my head. Are you? The thought of Philip Sterling in love is too comical. I thought you were only in love with the Ilium coal mine, which you and father talk about half the time." This is a specimen of Philip's wooing. "Confound the girl," he would say to himself, "why does she never tease Harry and that young Shepley who comes here?" How differently Alice treated him! She at least never mocked him, and it was a relief to talk with one who had some sympathy with him. And he did talk to her, by the hour, about Ruth. The blundering fellow poured all his doubts and anxieties into her ear, as if she had been the impassive occupant of one of those little wooden confessionals in the cathedral on Logan Square. Has a confessor, if she is young and pretty, any feeling? Does it mend the matter by calling her your sister? Philip called Alice his good sister, and talked to her about love and marriage, meaning Ruth, as if sisters could by no possibility have any personal concern in such things. Did Ruth ever speak of him? Did she think Ruth cared for him? Did Ruth care for anybody at Fallkill? Did she care for anything except her profession? And so on. Alice was loyal to Ruth, and if she knew anything she did not betray her friend. She did not, at any rate, give Philip too much encouragement. What woman, under the circumstances, would? "I can tell you one thing, Philip," she said. "If ever Ruth Bolton loves, it will be with her whole soul, in a depth of passion that will sweep everything before it and surprise even herself." A remark that did not much console Philip, who imagined that only some grand heroism could unlock the sweetness of such a heart. And Philip feared that he wasn't a hero. He did not know out of what materials a woman can construct a hero when she is in the creative mood. Harry skipped into this society with his usual lightness and gaiety. His good nature was inexhaustible, and though he liked to relate his own exploits, he had little tact in adapting himself to the tastes of his hearers. He was not long in finding out that Alice liked to hear about Philip, and Harry launched out into the career of his friend in the West, with a prodigality of invention that would have astonished the chief actor. He was the most generous fellow in the world, and picturesque conversation was the one thing in which he never was bankrupt. With Mr. Bolton he was the serious man of business, enjoying the confidence of many of the moneyed men in New York, whom Mr. Bolton knew, and engaged with them in railway schemes and government contracts. Philip, who had so long known Harry, never could make up his mind that Harry did not himself believe that he was a chief actor in all these large operations of which he talked so much. Harry did not neglect to endeavor to make himself agreeable to Mrs. Bolton by paying great attention to the children, and by professing the warmest interest in the Friends' faith. It always seemed to him the most peaceful religion. He thought it must be much easier to live by an internal light than by a lot of outward rules. He had a dear Quaker aunt in Providence of whom Mrs. Bolton constantly reminded him. He insisted upon going with Mrs. Bolton and the children to the Friends' meeting on First Day, when Ruth and Alice and Philip, world's people, went to a church in town, and he sat through the hour of silence with his hat on, in most exemplary patience. In short, this amazing actor succeeded so well with Mrs. Bolton that she said to Philip one day, "Thy friend Henry Brierly appears to be a very worldly-minded young man. Does he believe in anything?" "Oh, yes," said Philip, laughing. "He believes in more things than any other person I ever saw." To Ruth, Harry seemed to be very congenial. He was never moody for one thing, but lent himself with alacrity to whatever his fancy was. He was gay or grave as the need might be. No one apparently could enter more fully into her plans for an independent career. "My father," said Harry, "was bred a physician, and practiced a little before he went into Wall Street. I always had a leaning to the study. There was a skeleton hanging in the closet of my father's study when I was a boy that I used to dress up in old clothes. Oh, I got quite familiar with the human frame." "You must have," said Philip. "Was that where you learned to play the bones? He is a master of those musical instruments, Ruth. He plays well enough to go on the stage." "Philip hates science of any kind and steady application," retorted Harry. He didn't fancy Philip's banter, and when the latter had gone out, and Ruth asked, "Why don't you take up medicine, Mr. Brierly?" Harry said, "I have it in mind. I believe I would begin attending lectures this winter if it weren't for being wanted in Washington, but medicine is particularly women's province." "Why so?" asked Ruth, rather amused. "Well, the treatment of disease is a good deal a matter of sympathy. A woman's intuition is better than a man's. Nobody knows anything, really, you know, and a woman can guess a good deal nearer than a man." "You are very complimentary to my sex." "But," said Harry frankly, "I should want to choose my doctor. An ugly woman would ruin me. The disease would be sure to strike in and kill me at sight of her. I think a pretty physician with engaging manners would coax a fellow to live through almost anything." "I'm afraid you are a scoffer, Mr. Brierly." "On the contrary, I am quite sincere. Wasn't it old What's-his-name that said only the beautiful is useful?" Whether Ruth was anything more than diverted with Harry's company, Philip could not determine. He scorned, at any rate, to advance his own interest by any disparaging communications about Harry, both because he could not help liking the fellow himself, and because he may have known that he could not more surely create a sympathy for him in Ruth's mind. That Ruth was in no danger of any serious impression he felt pretty sure, felt certain of it, when he reflected upon her severe occupation with her profession. "Hang it," he would say to himself, "she is nothing but pure intellect, anyway." And he only felt uncertain of it when she was in one of her moods of raillery, with mocking mischief in her eyes. At such times she seemed to prefer Harry's society to his. When Philip was miserable about this, he always took refuge with Alice, who was never moody, and who generally laughed him out of his sentimental nonsense. He felt at his ease with Alice, and was never in want of something to talk about, and he could not account for the fact that he was so often dull with Ruth, with whom, of all persons in the world, he wanted to appear at his best. Harry was entirely satisfied with his own situation. A bird of passage is always at its ease, having no house to build, and no responsibility. He talked freely with Philip about Ruth, an almighty fine girl, he said, but what the deuce she wanted to study medicine for he couldn't see. There was a concert one night at the Musical Fund Hall, and the four had arranged to go in and return by the Germantown cars. It was Philip's plan, who had engaged the seats, and promised himself an evening with Ruth, walking with her, sitting by her in the hall, and enjoying the feeling of protecting that a man always has of a woman in a public place. He was fond of music, too, in a sympathetic way. At least, he knew that Ruth's delight in it would be enough for him. Perhaps he meant to take advantage of the occasion, to say some very serious things. His love for Ruth was no secret to Mrs. Bolton, and he felt almost sure that he should have no opposition in the family. Mrs. Bolton had been cautious in what she said, but Philip inferred everything from her reply to his own questions one day. "Has thee ever spoken thy mind to Ruth?" Why shouldn't he speak his mind, and end his doubts? Ruth had been more tricksy than usual that day, and in a flow of spirits quite inconsistent, it would seem, in a young lady devoted to grave studies. Had Ruth a premonition of Philip's intention in his manner? It may be, for when the girls came downstairs ready to walk to the cars, and met Philip and Harry in the hall, Ruth said, laughing, "The two tallest must walk together," and before Philip knew how it happened, Ruth had taken Harry's arm, and his evening was spoiled. He had too much politeness and good sense and kindness to show in his manner that he was hit. So he said to Harry, "That's your disadvantage in being short," and he gave Alice no reason to feel during the evening that she would not have been his first choice for the excursion, but he was none the less chagrined and not a little angry at the turn the affair took. The hall was crowded with the fashion of the town. The concert was one of those fragmentary drearinesses that people endure because they are fashionable, tours de force on the piano, and fragments from operas which have no meaning without the setting, with weary pauses of waiting in between. There is the comic basso, who is so amusing and on such familiar terms with the audience, and always sings the barber. The attitudinizing tenor, with his languishing "Oh, summer night," the soprano with her "Batti, batti," who warbles and trills, and runs and fetches her breath, and ends with a noble scream that brings down the tempest of applause, in the midst of which she backs off the stage smiling and bowing. It was this sort of concert, and Philip was thinking that it was the most stupid one he had ever sat through, when, just as the soprano was in the midst of that touching ballad, Coming Through the Rye, the soprano always sings Coming Through the Rye on an encore. The Black Swan used to make it irresistible, Philip remembered, with her arch, "If a body kiss a body." There was a cry of fire. The hall is long and narrow, and there is only one place of egress. Instantly the audience was on its feet, and a rush began for the door. Men shouted, women screamed, and panic seized the swaying mass. A second's thought would have convinced everyone that getting out was impossible, and that the only effect of a rush would be to crash people to death. But a second's thought was not given. A few cried, "Sit down! Sit down!" but the mass was turned towards the door. Women were down and trampled on in the aisles, and stout men, utterly lost to self-control, were mounting the benches, as if to run a race over the mass to the entrance. Philip, who had forced the girls to keep their seats, saw in a flash the new danger, and sprang to avert it. In a second more those infuriated men would be over the benches and crushing Ruth and Alice under their boots. He leapt upon the bench in front of them and struck out before him with all his might, felling one man who was rushing on him, and checking for an instant the movement, or rather parting it, and causing it to flow on either side of him. But it was only for an instant. The pressure behind was too great, and the next Philip was dashed backwards over the seat. And yet that instant of arrest had probably saved the girls, for as Philip fell, the orchestra struck up Yankee Doodle in the liveliest manner. The familiar tune caught the ear of the mass, which paused in wonder, and gave the conductor's voice a chance to be heard. "It's a false alarm!" The tumult was over in a minute, and the next, laughter was heard, and not a few said, "I knew it wasn't anything. What fools people are at such a time!" The concert was over, however. A good many people were hurt, some of them seriously, and among them Philip Sterling was found bent across the seat, insensible, with his left arm hanging limp, and a bleeding wound on his head. When he was carried into the air he revived, and said it was nothing. A surgeon was called, and it was thought best to drive at once to the Boltons, the surgeon supporting Philip, who did not speak the whole way. His arm was set and his head dressed, and the surgeon said he would come round all right in his mind by morning. He was very weak. Alice, who was not much frightened while the panic lasted in the hall, was very much unnerved by seeing Philip so pale and bloody. Ruth assisted the surgeon with the utmost coolness, and with skillful hands helped to dress Philip's wounds, and there was a certain intentness and fierce energy in what she did that might have revealed something to Philip if he had been in his senses. But he was not, or he would not have murmured, "Let Alice do it. She is not too tall." It was Ruth's first case. End of chapter 31. This is section 32 of The Gilded Age. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Gilded Age, A Tale of Today, by Mark Twain and C.D. Warner, chapter 32. Washington's delight in his beautiful sister was measureless. He said that she had always been the queenliest creature in the land, but that she was only commonplace before, compared to what she was now. So extraordinary was the improvement wrought by rich, fashionable attire. "But your criticisms are too full of brotherly partiality to be depended on, Washington. Other people will judge differently." "Indeed they won't. You'll see. There will never be a woman in Washington that can compare with you. You'll be famous within a fortnight, Laura. Everybody will want to know you. You wait. You'll see." Laura wished in her heart that the prophecy might come true, and privately she even believed it might, for she had brought all the women whom she had seen since she left home under sharp inspection, and the result had not been unsatisfactory to her. During a week or two Washington drove about the city every day with her and familiarized her with all of its salient features. She was beginning to feel very much at home with the town itself, and she was also fast acquiring ease with the distinguished people she met at the Dilworthy table, and losing what little of country timidity she had brought with her from Hawkeye. She noticed with secret pleasure the little start of admiration that always manifested itself in the faces of the guests when she entered the drawing-room arrayed in evening costume. She took comforting note of the fact that these guests directed a very liberal share of their conversation toward her. She observed with surprise that famous statesmen and soldiers did not talk like gods, as a general thing, but said rather commonplace things for the most part, and she was filled with gratification to discover that she, on the contrary, was making a good many shrewd speeches, and now and then a really brilliant one, and, furthermore, that they were beginning to be repeated in social circles about the town. Congress began its sittings, and every day or two Washington escorted her to the galleries set apart for lady members of the households of senators and representatives. Here was a larger field and a wider competition, but still she saw that many eyes were uplifted toward her face, and that first one person and then another called a neighbor's attention to her. She was not too dull to perceive that the speeches of some of the younger statesmen were delivered about as much, and perhaps more, at her than to the presiding officer, and she was not sorry to see that the dapper young senator from Iowa came at once and stood in the open space before the president's desk to exhibit his feet as soon as she entered the gallery, whereas she had early learned from common report that his usual custom was to prop them on his desk and enjoy them himself with a selfish disregard of other people's longings. Invitations began to flow in upon her, and soon she was fairly in society. The season was now in full bloom, and the first select reception was at hand, that is to say, a reception confined to invited guests. Senator Dilworthy had become well convinced, by this time, that his judgment of the country-bred Missouri girl had not deceived him. It was plain that she was going to be a peerless missionary in the field of labor he designed her for, and therefore it would be perfectly safe and likewise judicious to send her forth well panoplied for her work. So he had added new and still richer costumes to her wardrobe, and assisted their attractions with costly jewelry, loans on the future land sale. This first select reception took place at a cabinet minister's, or rather a cabinet secretary's mansion. When Laura and the senator arrived, about 9:30 or 10 in the evening, the place was already pretty well crowded, and the white-gloved negro servant at the door was still receiving streams of guests. The drawing-rooms were brilliant with gaslight, and as hot as ovens. The host and hostess stood just within the door of entrance. Laura was presented, and then she passed on into the maelstrom of bejeweled and richly attired low-necked ladies and white kid-gloved and steel-pen-coated gentlemen, and wherever she moved she was followed by a buzz of admiration that was grateful to all her senses, so grateful indeed that her white face was tinged and its beauty heightened by a perceptible suffusion of color. She caught such remarks as, "Who is she?" "Superb woman!" "That is a new beauty from the West," etc., etc. Whenever she halted, she was presently surrounded by ministers, generals, congressmen, and all manner of aristocratic people. Introductions followed, and then the usual original question, "How do you like Washington, Miss Hawkins?" supplemented by that other usual original question, "Is this your first visit?" These two exciting topics being exhausted, conversation generally drifted into calmer channels, only to be interrupted at frequent intervals by new introductions and new inquiries as to how Laura liked the Capitol and whether it was her first visit or not. And thus, for an hour or more, the Duchess moved through the crush in a rapture of happiness, for her doubts were dead and gone. Now she knew she could conquer here. A familiar face appeared in the midst of the multitude, and Harry Brierly fought his difficult way to her side, his eyes shouting their gratification, so to speak. "Oh, this is happiness! Tell me, my dear Miss Hawkins—" "Shh! I know what you are going to ask. I do like Washington. I like it very much." "No, but I was going to ask—" "Yes, I am coming to it as fast as I can. It is my first visit. I think you should know that yourself." And straightway a wave of the crowd swept her beyond his reach. Now, what can the girl mean? Of course she likes Washington. I'm not such a dummy as to have to ask her that. And as to its being her first visit, why, bang it, she knows that I knew it was. Does she think I have turned idiot? Curious girl, anyway, but how they do swarm about her. She is the reigning belle of Washington after this night. She'll know 500 of the heaviest guns in the town before this night's nonsense is over. And this isn't even the beginning. Just as I used to say, she'll be a card in the matter of, yes, sir, she shall turn the men's heads and I'll turn the women's. What a team that will be in politics here! I wouldn't take $250,000 for what I can do in this present session. No, indeed, I wouldn't. Now, here, I don't altogether like this. That insignificant Secretary of Legation why, she's smiling on him as if and now on the Admiral. Now she's illuminating that stuffy congressman from Massachusetts. Vulgar, ungrammatical shovel-maker, greasy knave of spades. I don't like this sort of thing. She doesn't appear to be much distressed about me. She hasn't looked this way once. All right, my bird of paradise, if it suits you, go on. But I think I know your sex. I'll go to smiling around a little, too, and see what effect that will have on you. And he did smile around a little, and got as near to her as he could to watch the effect. But the scheme was a failure. He could not get her attention. She seemed wholly unconscious of him, and so he could not flirt with any spirit. He could only talk disjointedly. He could not keep his eyes on the charmers he talked to. He grew irritable, jealous, and very unhappy. He gave up his enterprise, leaned his shoulder against a fluted pilaster, and pouted while he kept watch upon Laura's every movement. His other shoulder stole the bloom from many a lovely cheek that brushed him in the surging crush, but he noted it not. He was too busy cursing himself inwardly for being an egotistical imbecile. An hour ago he had thought to take this country lass under his protection and show her life and enjoy her wonder and delight, and here she was immersed in the marvel up to her eyes, and just a trifle more at home in it than he was himself. And now his angry comments ran on again. Now she's sweetening old Brother Balaam, and well, he is inviting her to the Congressional prayer meeting, no doubt. Better let old Dilworthy alone to see that she doesn't overlook that. And now it's Splurge of New York, and now it's Batters of New Hampshire, and now the Vice President. Well, I may as well adjourn. I've got enough. But he hadn't. He got as far as the door, and then struggled back to take one more look, hating himself all the while for his weakness. Toward midnight, when supper was announced, the crowd thronged to the supper-room where a long table was decked out with what seemed a rare repast, but which consisted of things better calculated to feast the eye than the appetite. The ladies were soon seated in files along the wall, and in groups here and there, and the colored waiters filled the plates and glasses, and the male guests moved hither and thither, conveying them to the privileged sex. Harry took an ice, and stood up by the table with other gentlemen, and listened to the buzz of conversation while he ate. From these remarks he learned a good deal about Laura that was news to him. For instance, that she was of a distinguished Western family, that she was highly educated, that she was very rich and a great landed heiress, that she was not a professor of religion, and yet was a Christian in the truest and best sense of the word, for her whole heart was devoted to the accomplishment of a great and noble enterprise, none other than the sacrificing of her landed estates to the uplifting of the downtrodden negro, and the turning of his erring feet into the way of light and righteousness. Harry observed that as soon as one listener had absorbed the story, he turned about and delivered it to his next neighbor, and the latter individual straightway passed it on, and thus he saw it travel the round of the gentlemen and overflow rearward among the ladies. He could not trace it backward to its fountainhead, and so he could not tell who it was that started it. One thing annoyed Harry a great deal, and that was the reflection that he might have been in Washington days and days ago, and thrown his fascination about Laura with permanent effect while she was new and strange to the capital, instead of dawdling in Philadelphia to no purpose. He feared he had "missed a trick," as he expressed it. He only found one little opportunity of speaking again with Laura before the evening's festivities ended, and then, for the first time in years, his airy self-complacency failed him, his tongue's easy confidence forsook it in a great measure, and he was conscious of an unheroic timidity. He was glad to get away and find a place where he could despise himself in private and try to grow his clipped plumes again. When Laura reached home she was tired but exultant, and Senator Dilworthy was pleased and satisfied. He called Laura "my daughter" next morning, and gave her some "pin money," as he termed it, and she sent $150 of it to her mother and loaned a trifle to Colonel Sellers. Then the Senator had a long private conference with Laura, and unfolded certain plans of his for the good of the country, and religion, and the poor, and temperance, and showed her how she could assist him in developing these worthy and noble enterprises. End of chapter 32. This is section 33 of The Gilded Age. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Gilded Age, A Tale of Today, by Mark Twain and C.D. Warner, Chapter 33. Laura soon discovered that there were three distinct aristocracies in Washington. One of these, nicknamed the Antiques, consisted of cultivated, high-bred old families who looked back with pride upon an ancestry that had been always great in the nation's councils and its wars from the birth of the Republic downward. Into this select circle it was difficult to gain admission. Number 2 was the aristocracy of the middle ground, of which more anon. Number 3 lay beyond. Of it we will say a word here. We will call it the aristocracy of the parvenu, as indeed the general public did. Official position, no matter how obtained, entitled a man to a place in it, and carried his family with him, no matter whence they sprang. Great wealth gave a man a still higher and nobler place in it than did official position. If this wealth had been acquired by conspicuous ingenuity, with just a pleasant little spice of illegality about it, all the better. This aristocracy was fast, and not averse to ostentation. The aristocracy of the Antiques ignored the aristocracy of the parvenu. The parvenu laughed at the Antiques, and secretly envied them. There were certain important society customs which one in Laura's position needed to understand. For instance, when a lady of any prominence comes to one of our cities and takes up her residence, all the ladies of her grade favor her in turn with an initial call, giving their cards to the servant at the door by way of introduction. They come singly sometimes in couples, and always in elaborate full dress. They talk 2 minutes and a quarter, and then go. If the lady receiving the call desires a further acquaintance, she must return the visit within 2 weeks. To neglect it beyond that time means let the matter drop. But if she does return the visit within 2 weeks, it then becomes the other party's privilege to continue the acquaintance or drop it. She signifies her willingness to continue it by calling again any time within 12 months. After that, if the parties go on calling upon each other once a year in our large cities, that is sufficient, and the acquaintanceship holds good. The thing goes along smoothly now. The annual visits are made and returned with peaceful regularity and bland satisfaction, although it is not necessary that the two ladies shall actually see each other oftener than once every few years. Their cards preserve the intimacy and keep the acquaintanceship intact. For instance, Mrs. A. pays her annual visit, sits in her carriage and sends in her card with the lower right-hand corner turned down, which signifies that she has called in person. Mrs. B. sends down a word that she is engaged or wishes to be excused, or if she is a parvenu and low-bred, she perhaps sends word that she is not at home. Very good. Mrs. A. drives on happy and content. If Mrs. A.'s daughter marries, or a child is born to the family, Mrs. B. calls, sends in her card with the upper left-hand corner turned down, and then goes along about her affairs, for that inverted corner means congratulations. If Mrs. B.'s husband falls downstairs and breaks his neck, Mrs. A. calls, leaves her card with the upper right-hand corner turned down, and then takes her departure. This corner means condolence. It is very necessary to get the corners right, else one may unintentionally condole with a friend on a wedding or congratulate her upon a funeral. If either lady is about to leave the city, she goes to the other's house and leaves her card with P.P.C. engraved under the name, which signifies pay parting call. But enough of etiquette. Laura was early instructed in the mysteries of society life by a competent mentor, and thus was preserved from troublesome mistakes. The first fashionable call she received from a member of the ancient nobility, otherwise the antiques, was of a pattern with all she received from that limb of the aristocracy afterward. This call was paid by Mrs. Major General Fulkerson and daughter. They drove up at 1 in the afternoon in a rather antiquated vehicle with a faded coat of arms on the panels, an aged white-wooled negro coachman on the box, and a younger darky beside him, the footman. Both of these servants were dressed in dull brown livery that had seen considerable service. The ladies entered the drawing-room in full character, that is to say, with Elizabethan stateliness on the part of the dowager, and an easy grace and dignity on the part of the young lady that had a nameless something about it that suggested conscious superiority. The dresses of both ladies were exceedingly rich, as to material, but as notably modest as to color and ornament. All parties having seated themselves, the dowager delivered herself of a remark that was not unusual in its form, and yet it came from her lips with the impressiveness of Scripture. "The weather has been unpropitious of late, Miss Hawkins." "It has indeed," said Laura. "The climate seems to be variable." "It is its nature of old here," said the daughter, stating it apparently as a fact only, and by her manner waving aside all personal responsibility on account of it. "Is it not so, mamma?" "Quite so, my child. Do you like winter, Miss Hawkins?" She said "like" as if she had an idea that its dictionary meaning was "approve of." "Not as well as summer, though I think all seasons have their charms." "It is a very just remark. The General held similar views. He considered snow in winter proper, sultriness in summer legitimate, frosts in the autumn the same, and rains in spring not objectionable. He was not an exacting man, and I call to mind now that he always admired thunder. You remember, child, your father always admired thunder?" "He adored it." "No doubt it reminded him of battle," said Laura. "Yes, I think perhaps it did. He had a great respect for nature. He often said there was something striking about the ocean. You remember his saying that, daughter?" "Yes, often, mother. I remember it very well." "And hurricanes. He took a great interest in hurricanes, and animals, dogs especially, hunting dogs, also comets. I think we all have our predilections. I think it is this that gives variety to our tastes." Laura coincided with this view. "Do you find it hard and lonely to be so far from your home and friends, Miss Hawkins?" "I do find it depressing sometimes, but then there is so much about me here that is novel and interesting that my days are made up more of sunshine than shadow." "Washington is not a dull city in the season," said the young lady. "We have some very good society indeed, and one need not be at a loss for means to pass the time pleasantly. Are you fond of watering places, Miss Hawkins?" "I have really had no experience of them, but I have always felt a strong desire to see something of fashionable watering-place life." "We of Washington are unfortunately situated in that respect," said the dowager. "It is a tedious distance to Newport, but there is no help for it." Laura said to herself, "Long Branch and Cape May are nearer than Newport. Doubtless these places are low. I'll feel my way a little and see." Then she said aloud, "Why, I thought that Long Branch—" There was no need to feel any further. There was that in both faces before her which made that truth apparent. The dowager said, "Nobody goes there, Miss Hawkins, at least only persons of no position in society, and the President." She added that with tranquillity. "Newport is damp and cold and windy and excessively disagreeable," said the daughter, "but it is very select. One cannot be fastidious about minor matters when one has no choice." The visit had spun out nearly 3 minutes now. Both ladies rose with grave dignity, conferred upon Laura a formal invitation to call, and then retired from the conference. Laura remained in the drawing-room and left them to pilot themselves out of the house, an inhospitable thing, it seemed to her, but then she was following her instructions. She stood, steeped in reverie, a while, and then she said, "I think I could always enjoy icebergs, as scenery but not as company." Still, she knew these two people by reputation, and was aware that they were not icebergs when they were in their own waters and amid their legitimate surroundings, but on the contrary were people to be respected for their stainless characters and esteemed for their social virtues and their benevolent impulses. She thought it a pity that they had to be such changed and dreary creatures on occasions of state. The first call Laura received from the other extremity of the Washington aristocracy followed close upon the heels of the one we have just been describing. The callers this time were the Honorable Mrs. Oliver Higgins, the Honorable Mrs. Patrick Oreille, pronounced O'Relay, Miss Bridget, pronounced Briget, O'Relay, Mrs. Peter Gashley, Miss Gashley, and Miss Emmeline Gashley. The three carriages arrived at the same moment from different directions. They were new and wonderfully shiny, and the brasses on the harness were highly polished and bore complicated monograms. There were showy coats of arms, too, with Latin mottos. The coachmen and footmen were clad in bright new livery of striking colors, and they had black rosettes with shaving-brushes projecting above them on the sides of their stove-pipe hats. When the visitors swept into the drawing-room, they filled the place with a suffocating sweetness procured at the perfumer's. Their costumes, as to architecture, were the latest fashion intensified. They were rainbow-hued, they were hung with jewels, chiefly diamonds. It would have been plain to any eye that it had cost something to upholster these women. The Honorable Mrs. Oliver Higgins was the wife of a delegate from a distant territory, a gentleman who had kept the principal saloon and sold the best whiskey in the principal village in his wilderness, and so, of course, was recognized as the first man of his commonwealth and its fittest representative. He was a man of paramount influence at home, for he was public-spirited, he was chief of the fire department, he had an admirable command of profane language, and had killed several parties. His shirt-fronts were always immaculate, his boots daintily polished, and no man could lift a foot and fire a dead shot at a stray speck of dirt on it with a white handkerchief with a finer grace than he. His watch-chain weighed a pound, the gold in his finger-ring was worth $45. He wore a diamond cluster-pin, and he parted his hair behind. He had always been regarded as the most elegant gentleman in his territory, and it was conceded by all that no man thereabouts was anywhere near his equal in the telling of an obscene story, except the venerable white-haired governor himself. The Honorable Higgins had not come to serve his country in Washington for nothing. The appropriation which he had engineered through Congress for the maintenance of the Indians in his territory would have made all those savages rich if it had ever got to them. The Honorable Mrs. Higgins was a picturesque woman, and a fluent talker, and she held a tolerably high station among the parvenus. Her English was fair enough, as a general thing, though being of New York origin she had the fashion peculiar to many natives of that city of pronouncing saw and law as if they were spelt sore and lore. Petroleum was the agent that had suddenly transformed the Gashleys from modest, hard-working country village folk into loud aristocrats and ornaments of the city. The Honorable Patrick Oreille was a wealthy Frenchman from Cork, not that he was wealthy when he first came from Cork, but just the reverse. When he first landed in New York with his wife, he had only halted at Castle Garden for a few minutes to receive and exhibit papers showing that he had resided in this country 2 years, and then he voted the Democratic ticket and went uptown to hunt a house. He found one, and then went to work as assistant to an architect and builder, carrying a hod all day and studying politics evenings. Industry and economy soon enabled him to start a low rum shop in a foul locality, and this gave him political influence. In our country it is always our first care to see that our people have the opportunity of voting for their choice of men to represent and govern them. We do not permit our great officials to appoint the little officials. We prefer to have so tremendous a power as that in our own hands. We hold it safest to elect our judges and everybody else. In our cities, the ward meetings elect delegates to the nominating conventions and instruct them whom to nominate. The publicans and their retainers rule the ward meetings, for everybody else hates the worry of politics and stays at home. The delegates from the ward meetings organize as a nominating convention and make up a list of candidates, one convention offering a Democratic and another a Republican list of incorruptibles, and then the great meek public come forward at the proper time and make unhampered choice, and bless heaven that they live in a free land where no form of despotism can ever intrude. Patrick O'Reilly, as his name then stood, created friends and influence very fast, for he was always on hand at the police courts to give straw bail for his customers or establish an alibi for them in case they had been beating anybody to death on his premises. Consequently, he presently became a political leader, and was elected to a petty office under the city government. Out of a meager salary he soon saved money enough to open quite a stylish liquor saloon higher up town, with a faro bank attached, and plenty of capital to conduct it with. This gave him fame and great respectability. The position of alderman was forced upon him, and it was just the same as presenting him a gold mine. He had fine horses and carriages now, and closed up his whiskey mill. By and by he became a large contractor for city work, and was a bosom friend of the great and good William M. Weed himself, who had stolen $20,600,000 from the city, and was a man so envied, so honored, so adored indeed, that when the sheriff went to his office to arrest him as a felon, that sheriff blushed and apologized, and one of the illustrated papers made a picture of the scene and spoke of the matter in such a way as to show that the editor regretted that the offense of an arrest had been offered to so exalted a personage as Mr. Weed. Mr. O'Reilly furnished shingle nails to the new courthouse at $3,000 a keg, and 18 gross of 60-cent thermometers at $1,500 a dozen. The Comptroller and the Board of Audit passed the bills, and a mayor, who was simply ignorant but not criminal, signed them. When they were paid, Mr. O'Reilly's admirers gave him a solitaire diamond pin of the size of a filbert, in imitation of the liberality of Mr. Weed's friends, and then Mr. O'Reilly retired from active service, and amused himself with buying real estate at enormous figures, and holding it in other people's names. By and by the newspapers came out with exposures, and called Weed and O'Reilly thieves, whereupon the people rose as one man, voting repeatedly, and elected the two gentlemen to their proper theater of action, the New York legislature. The newspapers clamored, and the courts proceeded to try the new legislators for their small irregularities. Our admirable jury system enabled the persecuted ex-officials to secure a jury of 9 gentlemen from a neighboring asylum and 3 graduates from Sing Sing, and presently they walked forth with characters vindicated. The legislature was called upon to spew them forth, a thing which the legislature declined to do. It was like asking children to repudiate their own father. It was a legislature of the modern pattern. Being now wealthy and distinguished, Mr. O'Reilly, still bearing the legislative "Honorable" attached to his name, for titles never die in America, although we do take a republican pride in poking fun at such trifles, sailed for Europe with his family. They traveled all about, turning their noses up at everything, and not finding it a difficult thing to do, either, because nature had originally given those features a cast in that direction. And finally they established themselves in Paris, that paradise of Americans of their sort. They stayed there 2 years and learned to speak English with a foreign accent. Not that it hadn't always had a foreign accent, which was indeed the case, but now the nature of it was changed. Finally they returned home and became ultra-fashionables. They landed here as the Honorable Patrick O'Reilly and family, and so are known unto this day. Laura provided seats for her visitors, and they immediately launched forth into a breezy, sparkling conversation with that easy confidence which is to be found only among persons accustomed to high life.
"I've been intending to call sooner, Miss Hawkins,"
said the Honorable Mrs. O'Reilly,
"but the weather's been so horrid. How do you like Washington?"
Laura liked it very well indeed. Mrs. Gashly,
"Is it your first visit?"
Yes, it was her first. All.
"Indeed."
Mrs. O'Reilly,
"I'm afraid you'll despise the weather, Miss Hawkins. It's perfectly awful. It always is." I tell Mr. Overlay I can't and I won't put up with any such a climate. If we were obliged to do it, I wouldn't mind, but we are not obliged to, and so I don't see the use of it. Sometimes it's real pitiful the way the children pine for Paris. Don't look so sad, Brigitte, ma chère. Poor child, she can't hear Paris mentioned without getting the blues.
Mrs. Gashly.
Well, I should think so, Mrs. Overlay. A body lives in Paris, but a body only stays here. I dote on Paris. I'd druther scrimp along on $10,000 a year there than suffer and worry here on a real decent income.
Miss Gashly.
Well, then, I wish you'd take us back, Mother. I'm sure I hate this stupid country enough, even if it is our dear native land.
Miss Emmeline Gashly.
What, and leave poor Johnny Peterson behind?
An airy, genial laugh applauded this sally.
Miss Gashly. Sister, I should think you'd be ashamed of yourself.
Miss Emmeline.
Oh, you needn't ruffle your feathers so. I was only joking. He don't mean anything by coming to the house every evening. Only comes to see Mother. Of course, that's all.
General laughter. Miss G. prettily confused.
Emmeline, how can you?
Mrs. G.
Let your sister alone, Emmeline. I never saw such a tease.
Mrs. Overlay.
What lovely corrals you have, Miss Hawkins. Just look at them, Bridget, dear. I've a great passion for corrals. It's a pity they're getting a little common. I have some elegant ones, not as elegant as yours, though, but of course I don't wear them now.
Laura.
I suppose they are rather common, but still I have a great affection for these, because they were given to me by a dear old friend of our family named Murphy. He was a very charming man, but very eccentric. He always supposed he was an Irishman, but after he got rich he went abroad for a year or two, and when he came back you would have been amused to see how interested he was in a potato. He asked what it was. Now you know that when Providence shapes a mouth especially for the accommodation of a potato, you can detect that fact at a glance when that mouth is in repose. Foreign travel can never remove that sign. But he was a very delightful gentleman, and his little foible did not hurt him at all. We all have our shams. I suppose there is a sham somewhere about every individual, if we could manage to ferret it out. I would so like to go to France. I suppose our society here compares very favorably with French society, does it not, Mrs. Overlay?
Mrs. O.
Not by any means, Miss Hawkins. French society is much more elegant, much more so.
Laura.
I am sorry to hear that. I suppose ours has deteriorated of late.
Mrs. O.
Very much indeed. There are people in society here that have really no more money to live on than what some of us pay for servant hire. Still, I won't say but what some of them are very good people, and respectable, too.
Laura.
The old families seem to be holding themselves aloof, from what I hear. I suppose you seldom meet in society now the people you used to be familiar with 12 or 15 years ago?
Mrs. O.
Oh, no, hardly ever.
Mr. O'Reilly kept his first rum mill and protected his customers from the law in those days, and this turn of the conversation was rather uncomfortable to Madame than otherwise. Honorable Mrs. Higgins.
Is Francois's health good now, Mrs. Overlay?
Mrs. O., thankful for the intervention.
Not very. A body couldn't expect it. He was always delicate, especially his lungs, and this odious climate tells on him strong now, after Paris, which is so mild.
Mrs. H.
I should think so. Husband says Percy'll die if he don't have a change, and so I'm going to swap round a little and see what can be done. I saw a lady from Florida last week, and she recommended Key West. I told her Percy couldn't abide winds, as he was threatened with a pulmonary affection, and then she said, try St. Augustine. It's an awful distance, 10 or 1200 mile, they say. But then, in a case of this kind, a body can't stand back for trouble, you know.
Mrs. O.
No, of course, that's off. If Francois don't get better soon, we've got to look out for some other place, or else Europe. We've thought some of the hot springs, but I don't know. It's a great responsibility, and a body wants to go cautious. Is Hildebrand about again, Mrs. Gashly?
Mrs. G.
Yes, but that's about all. It was indigestion, you know.
and it looks as if it was chronic. And you know I do dread dyspepsia. We've all been worried a good deal about him. The doctor recommended baked apple and spoiled meat, and I think it done him good. It's about the only thing that will stay on his stomach nowadays. We have Dr. Shovel now. Who's your doctor, Mrs. Higgins? Mrs. H. Well, we had Dr. Spooner a good while, but he runs so much to emetics, which I think are weakening, that we changed off and took Dr. Leathers. We like him very much. He has a fine European reputation, too. The first thing he suggested for Percy was to have him taken out in the backyard for an airing every afternoon, with nothing at all on. Mrs. O. and Mrs. G. What? Mrs. H. As true as I'm sitting here. And it actually helped him for 2 or 3 days. It did indeed. But after that the doctor said it seemed to be too severe, and so he has fell back on hot foot baths at night and cold showers in the morning. But I don't think there can be any good sound help for him in such a climate as this. I believe we are going to lose him if we don't make a change. Mrs. O. I suppose you heard of the fright we had 2 weeks ago last Saturday? No? Why, that is strange. But, come to remember, you've all been away to Richmond. Francois tumbled from the skylight in the 2nd-story hall clean down to the 1st floor. Everybody, mercy! Mrs. O. Oh, yes, indeed, and broke 2 of his ribs. Everybody, what? Mrs. O. Just as true as you live. First we thought he must be injured internally. It was 15 minutes past 8 in the evening. Of course we were all distracted in a moment. Everybody was flying everywhere, and nobody doing anything worth anything. By and by I flung out next door and dragged in Dr. Sprague, president of the medical university, no time to go for our own doctor, of course, and the minute he saw Francois he said, "Send for your own physician, madam," said it as cross as a bear, too, and turned right on his heel and cleared out without doing a thing. Everybody, the mean, contemptible brute! Mrs. O. Well, you may say it. I was nearly out of my wits by this time, but we hurried off the servants after our own doctor and telegraphed Mother. She was in New York and rushed down on the first train. And when the doctor got there, lo and behold you, he found Francois had broke one of his legs, too. Everybody, goodness! Mrs. O. Yes, so he set his leg and bandaged it up, and fixed his ribs, and gave him a dose of something to quiet down his excitement, and put him to sleep. Poor thing, he was trembling and frightened to death, and it was pitiful to see him. We had him in my bed. Mr. Oberlé slept in the guest-room, and I laid down beside Francois. But not to sleep, bless you, no. Bridget and I sat up all night, and the doctor stayed till 2 in the morning, bless his old heart. When Mother got there she was so used up with anxiety that she had to go to bed and have the doctor, and when she found that Francois was not in immediate danger she rallied, and by night she was able to take a watch herself. Well, for 3 days and nights we 3 never left that bedside, only to take an hour's nap at a time. And then the doctor said Francois was out of danger, and if ever there was a thankful set in this world it was us. Laura's respect for these women had augmented during this conversation, naturally enough. Affection and devotion are qualities that are able to adorn and render beautiful a character that is otherwise unattractive and even repulsive. Mrs. Gashly. I do believe I should have died if I had been in your place, Mrs. Oberlé. The time Hildebrand was so low with the pneumonia, Emmeline and me were all alone with him most of the time, and we never took a minute's sleep for as much as 2 days and nights. It was at Newport, and we wouldn't trust hired nurses. One afternoon he had a fit, and jumped up and run out of the portico of the hotel with nothing in the world on, and the wind a-blowing like ice, and we after him scared to death. And when the ladies and gentlemen saw that he had a fit, every lady scattered for her room, and not a gentleman lifted his hand to help, the wretches. Well, after that his life hung by a thread for as much as 10 days, and the minute he was out of danger, Emmeline and me just went to bed sick and worn out. I never want to pass through such a time again. Poor dear Francois! Which leg did he break, Mrs. Oberlé? Mrs. O. It was his right-hand hind leg. Jump down, Francois dear, and show the ladies what a cruel limp you've got yet. Francois demurred, but being coaxed and delivered gently upon the floor, he performed very satisfactorily, with his right-hand hind leg in the air. All were affected, even Laura, but hers was an affection of the stomach. The country-bred girl had not suspected that the little whining 10-ounce black and tan reptile, clad in a red embroidered pygmy blanket and reposing in Mrs. Overlay's lap all through the visit, was the individual whose sufferings had been stirring the dormant generosities of her nature. She said,
"Poor little creature, you might have lost him."
Mrs. O.
"Oh, pray don't mention it, Miss Hawkins. It gives me such a turn."
Laura.
"And Hildebrand and Percy, are they like this one?"
Mrs. G.
"No, Hilly has considerable Skye blood in him, I believe."
Mrs. H.
"Percy's the same, only he is 2 months and 10 days older and has his ears cropped. His father, Martin Farquhar Tupper, was sickly and died young, but he was the sweetest disposition. His mother had heart disease, but was very gentle and resigned, and a wonderful ratter."
As impossible and exasperating as this conversation may sound to a person who is not an idiot, it is scarcely in any respect an exaggeration of one which one of us actually listened to in an American drawing-room. Otherwise we could not venture to put such a chapter into a book which professes to deal with social possibilities. The Authors. So carried away had the visitors become by their interest attaching to this discussion of family matters, that their stay had been prolonged to a very improper and unfashionable length, but they suddenly recollected themselves now, and took their departure. Laura's scorn was boundless. The more she thought of these people and their extraordinary talk, the more offensive they seemed to her, and yet she confessed that if one must choose between the two extreme aristocracies, it might be best, on the whole, looking at things from a strictly business point of view, to herd with the parvenu. She was in Washington solely to compass a certain matter, and to do it at any cost, and these people might be useful to her, while it was plain that her purposes and her schemes for pushing them would not find favor in the eyes of the antiques. If it came to choice, and it might come to that sooner or later, she believed she could come to a decision without much difficulty or many pangs. But the best aristocracy of the three Washington castes, and really the most powerful by far, was that of the middle ground. It was made up of the families of public men from nearly every state in the Union, men who held positions in both the executive and legislative branches of the government, and whose characters had been for years blemishless, both at home and at the capital. These gentlemen and their households were unostentatious people. They were educated and refined. They troubled themselves but little about the two other orders of nobility, but moved serenely in their wide orbit, confident in their own strength and well aware of the potency of their influence. They had no troublesome appearances to keep up, no rivalries which they cared to distress themselves about, no jealousies to fret over. They could afford to mind their own affairs and leave other combinations to do the same or do otherwise, just as they chose. They were people who were beyond reproach, and that was sufficient. Senator Dilworthy never came into collision with any of these factions. He labored for them all and with them all. He said that all men were brethren, and all were entitled to the honest, unselfish help and countenance of a Christian laborer in the public vineyard. Laura concluded, after reflection, to let circumstances determine the course it might be best for her to pursue as regarded the several aristocracies. Now it might occur to the reader that perhaps Laura had been somewhat rudely suggestive in her remarks to Mrs. Overlay when the subject of corals was under discussion, but it did not occur to Laura herself. She was not a person of exaggerated refinement. Indeed, the society and the influences that had formed her character had not been of a nature calculated to make her so. She thought that give and take was fair play, and that to parry an offensive thrust with a sarcasm was a neat and legitimate thing to do. She sometimes talked to people in a way which some ladies would consider actually shocking, but Laura rather prided herself upon some of her exploits of that character. We are sorry we cannot make her a faultless heroine, but we cannot, for the reason that she was human. She considered herself a superior conversationist. Long ago, when the possibility had first been brought before her mind that some day she might move in Washington society, she had recognized the fact that practiced conversational powers would be a necessary weapon in that field. She had also recognized the fact that since her dealings there must be mainly with men, and men whom she supposed to be exceptionally cultivated and able, she would need heavier shot in her magazine than mere brilliant society nothings. Whereupon she had at once entered upon a tireless and elaborate course of reading, and had never since ceased to devote every unoccupied moment to this sort of preparation. Having now acquired a happy smattering of various information, she used it with good effect. She passed for a singularly well-informed woman in Washington. The quality of her literary tastes had necessarily undergone constant improvement under this regimen, and as necessarily also the duality of her language had improved, though it cannot be denied that now and then her former condition of life betrayed itself in just perceptible inelegancies of expression and lapses of grammar. End of chapter 33. The Gilded Age, Section 34. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Gilded Age, A Tale of Today by Mark Twain and C.D. Warner, Chapter 34. When Laura had been in Washington 3 months, she was still the same person in one respect that she was when she arrived there. That is to say, she still bore the name of Laura Hawkins. Otherwise, she was perceptibly changed. She had arrived in a state of grievous uncertainty as to what manner of woman she was, physically and intellectually, as compared with Eastern women. She was well satisfied now that her beauty was confessed, her mind a grade above the average, and her powers of fascination rather extraordinary. So she was at ease upon those points. When she arrived she was possessed of habits of economy and not possessed of money. Now she dressed elaborately, gave but little thought to the cost of things, and was very well fortified financially. She kept her mother and Washington freely supplied with money, and did the same by Colonel Sellers, who always insisted upon giving his note for loans, with interest. He was rigid upon that. She must take interest, and one of the Colonel's greatest satisfactions was to go over his accounts and note what a handsome sum this accruing interest amounted to, and what a comfortable though modest support it would yield Laura in case reverses should overtake her. In truth, he could not help feeling that he was an efficient shield for her against poverty, and so, if her expensive ways ever troubled him for a brief moment, he presently dismissed the thought and said to himself, "Let her go on. Even if she loses everything, she is still safe. This interest will always afford her a good easy income." Laura was on excellent terms with a great many members of Congress, and there was an undercurrent of suspicion in some quarters that she was one of that detested class known as lobbyists. But what belle could escape slander in such a city? Fair-minded people declined to condemn her on mere suspicion, and so the injurious talk made no very damaging headway. She was very gay now, and very celebrated, and she might well expect to be assailed by many kinds of gossip. She was growing used to celebrity, and could already sit calm and seemingly unconscious under the fire of 50 lorgnettes in a theater, or even overhear the low voice, "That's she," as she passed along the street, without betraying annoyance. The whole air was full of a vague, vast scheme which was to eventuate in filling Laura's pockets with millions of dollars. Some had one idea of the scheme, and some another, but nobody had any exact knowledge upon the subject. All that any one felt sure about was that Laura's landed estates were princely in value and extent, and that the government was anxious to get hold of them for public purposes, and that Laura was willing to make the sale, but not at all anxious about the matter, and not at all in a hurry. It was whispered that Senator Dilworthy was a stumbling block in the way of an immediate sale, because he was resolved that the government should not have the lands except with the understanding that they should be devoted to the uplifting of the negro race. Laura did not care what they were devoted to, it was said, a world of very different gossip to the contrary notwithstanding, But there were several other heirs, and they would be guided entirely by the senator's wishes. And finally, many people averred that while it would be easy to sell the lands to the government for the benefit of the Negro by resorting to the usual methods of influencing votes, Senator Dilworthy was unwilling to have so noble a charity sullied by any taint of corruption. He was resolved that not a vote should be bought. Nobody could get anything definite from Laura about these matters, and so gossip had to feed itself chiefly upon guesses. But the effect of it all was that Laura was considered to be very wealthy, and likely to be vastly more so in a little while. Consequently, she was much courted and as much envied. Her wealth attracted many suitors. Perhaps they came to worship her riches, but they remained to worship her. Some of the noblest men of the time succumbed to her fascinations. She frowned upon no lover when he made his first advances, but by and by, when she was hopelessly enthralled, he learned from her own lips that she had formed a resolution never to marry. Then he would go away, hating and cursing the whole sex, and she would calmly add his scalp to her string, while she mused upon the bitter day that Colonel Selby trampled her love and her pride in the dust. In time it came to be said that her way was paved with broken hearts. Poor Washington gradually woke up to the fact that he too was an intellectual marvel as well as his gifted sister. He could not conceive how it had come about. It did not occur to him that the gossip about his family's great wealth had anything to do with it. He could not account for it by any process of reasoning, and was simply obliged to accept the fact and give up trying to solve the riddle. He found himself dragged into society and courted, wondered at, and envied, very much as if he were one of those foreign barbers who flit over here now and then with a self-conferred title of nobility and marry some rich fool's absurd daughter. Sometimes at a dinner-party or reception he would find himself the center of interest and feel unutterably uncomfortable in the discovery. Being obliged to say something, he would mine his brain and put in a blast, and when the smoke and flying debris had cleared away, the result would be what seemed to him but a poor little intellectual clod of dirt or two, and then he would be astonished to see everybody as lost in admiration as if he had brought up a ton or two of virgin gold. Every remark he made delighted his hearers and compelled their applause. He overheard people say he was exceedingly bright. They were chiefly mammas and marriageable young ladies. He found that some of his good things were being repeated about the town. Whenever he heard of an instance of this kind, he would keep that particular remark in mind and analyze it at home in private. At first he could not see that the remark was anything better than a parrot might originate, but by and by he began to feel that perhaps he underrated his powers, and after that he used to analyze his good things with a deal of comfort, and find in them a brilliancy which would have been unapparent to him in earlier days, and then he would make a note of that good thing, and say it again the first time he found himself in a new company. Presently he had saved up quite a repertoire of brilliancies, and after that he confined himself to repeating these, and ceased to originate any more, lest he might injure his reputation by an unlucky effort. He was constantly having young ladies thrust upon his notice at receptions, or left upon his hands at parties, and in time he began to feel that he was being deliberately persecuted in this way, and after that he could not enjoy society because of his constant dread of these female ambushes and surprises. He was distressed to find that nearly every time he showed a young lady a polite attention, he was straightway reported to be engaged to her. And as some of these reports got into the newspapers occasionally, he had to keep writing to Louise that they were lies, and she must believe in him and not mind them or allow them to grieve her. Washington was as much in the dark as anybody with regard to the great wealth that was hovering in the air and seemingly on the point of tumbling into the family pocket. Laura would give him no satisfaction. All she would say was, "Wait, be patient. You will see." "But will it be soon, Laura?" "It will not be very long, I think." "But what makes you think so?" "I have reasons, and good ones. Just wait and be patient." "But is it going to be as much as people say it is?" "What do they say it is?" "Oh, ever so much. Millions."
Yes, it will be a great sum.
But how great, Laura? Will it be millions?
Yes, you may call it that. Yes, it will be millions. There now, does that satisfy you?
Splendid. I can wait. I can wait patiently, ever so patiently. Once I was near selling the land for $20,000, once for $30,000, once after that for $7,000, and once for $40,000, but something always told me not to do it. What a fool I would have been to sell it for such a beggarly trifle. It is the land that's to bring the money, isn't it, Laura? You can tell me that much, can't you?
Yes, I don't mind saying that much. It is the land. But mind, don't ever hint that you got it from me. Don't mention me in the matter at all, Washington.
All right, I won't. Millions! Isn't it splendid? I mean to look around for a building lot, a lot with fine ornamental shrubbery and all that sort of thing. I will do it today. And I might as well see an architect, too, and get him to go to work at a plan for a house. I don't intend to spare any expense. I mean to have the noblest house that money can build. Then, after a pause, he did not notice Laura's smiles. "Laura, would you lay the main hall in encaustic tiles, or just in fancy patterns of hardwood?" Laura laughed a good old-fashioned laugh that had more of her former natural self about it than any sound that had issued from her mouth in many weeks, and she said, "You don't change, Washington. You still begin to squander a fortune, right and left, the instant you hear of it in the distance. You never wait till the foremost dollar of it arrives within 100 miles of you." And she kissed her brother good-bye and left him weltering in his dreams, so to speak. He got up and walked the floor feverishly during 2 hours, and when he sat down he had married Louise, built a house, reared a family, married them off, spent upwards of $800,000 on mere luxuries, and died worth 12 millions. End of chapter 34. This is section 35 of The Gilded Age. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Gilded Age, A Tale of Today by Mark Twain and C.D. Warner, chapter 35. Laura went downstairs, knocked at the study door, and entered, scarcely waiting for the response. Senator Dilworthy was alone, with an open Bible in his hand, upside down. Laura smiled and said, forgetting her acquired correctness of speech, "It is only me." "Ah, come in. Sit down." And the senator closed the book and laid it down. "I wanted to see you. Time to report progress from the Committee of the Whole." And the senator beamed with his own congressional wit.
"In the Committee of the Whole things are working very well. We have made ever so much progress in a week. I believe that you and I together could run this government beautifully, Uncle."
The senator beamed again. He liked to be called uncle by this beautiful woman. "Did you see Hopperson last night after the congressional prayer meeting?"
"Yes, he came. He's kind of—"
"Eh? He is one of my friends, Laura. He's a fine man, a very fine man. I don't know any man in Congress I'd sooner go to for help in any Christian work. What did he say?"
"Oh, he beat around a little. He said he should like to help the negro. His heart went out to the negro, and all that. Plenty of them say that, but he was a little afraid of the Tennessee Land Bill. If Senator Dilworthy wasn't in it, he should suspect there was a fraud on the government."
"He said that, did he?"
"Yes. And he said he felt he couldn't vote for it. He was shy."
"Not shy, child, cautious. He's a very cautious man. I have been with him a great deal on conference committees. He wants reasons, good ones. Didn't you show him he was in error about the bill?"
"I did. I went over the whole thing. I had to tell him some of the side arrangements, some of the—"
"You didn't mention me?"
"Oh, no. I told him you were daft about the negro and the philanthropy part of it, as you are."
"Daft is a little strong, Laura. But you know that I wouldn't touch this bill if it were not for the public good, and for the good of the colored race, much as I am interested in the heirs of this property, and would like to have them succeed." Laura looked a little incredulous, and the senator proceeded, "Don't misunderstand me. I don't deny that it is for the interest of all of us that this bill should go through, and it will. I have no concealments from you. But I have one principle in my public life which I should like you to keep in mind. It has always been my guide. I never push a private interest if it is not justified and ennobled by some larger public good. I doubt if a Christian would be justified in working for his own salvation if it was not to aid in the salvation of his fellow men."
The Senator spoke with feeling, and then added,
"I hope you showed Hopperson that our motives were pure."
"Yes, and he seemed to have a new light on the measure. I think he will vote for it."
"I hope so. His name will give tone and strength to it. I knew you would only have to show him that it was just and pure in order to secure his cordial support."
"I think I convinced him. Yes, I am perfectly sure he will vote right now."
"That's good, that's good," said the Senator, smiling and rubbing his hands. "Is there anything more?"
"You'll find some changes in that, I guess," handing the Senator a printed list of names. "Those checked off are all right."
"Ah,
running his eye down the list.
That's encouraging. What is the C before some of the names? And the B.B.?"
"Those are my private marks. That C stands for convinced, with argument. The B.B. is a general sign for a relative. You see, it stands before 3 of the honorable committee. I expect to see the chairman of the committee today, Mr. Buckstone."
"So you must. He ought to be seen without any delay. Buckstone is a worldly sort of a fellow, but he has charitable impulses. If we secure him, we shall have a favorable report by the committee, and it will be a great thing to be able to state that fact quietly where it will do good."
"Oh, I saw Senator Balloon."
"He will help us, I suppose. Balloon is a whole-hearted fellow. I can't help loving that man, for all his drollery and waggishness. He puts on an air of levity sometimes, but there ain't a man in the Senate knows the Scripture as he does. He did not make any objections?"
"Not exactly. He said—shall I tell you what he said?" asked Laura, glancing furtively at him.
"Certainly."
"He said he had no doubt it was a good thing, if Senator Dilworthy was in it. It would pay to look into it."
The Senator laughed, but rather feebly, and said, "Balloon is always full of his jokes."
"I explained it to him. He said it was all right. He only wanted a word with you," continued Laura. "He is a handsome old gentleman, and he is gallant for an old man."
"My daughter," said the Senator, with a grave look, "I trust there was nothing free in his manner?"
"Free?" repeated Laura, with indignation in her face.
"With me? There, child, I meant nothing. Balloon talks a little freely sometimes with men, but he is right at heart. His term expires next year, and I fear we shall lose him."
"He seemed to be packing the day I was there. His rooms were full of dry goods boxes, into which his servant was crowding all manner of old clothes and stuff. I suppose he will paint 'Pub. Docks' on them and frank them home. That's good economy, isn't it?"
"Yes, yes, but, child, all congressmen do that. It may not be strictly honest. Indeed, it is not unless he had some public documents mixed in with the clothes."
"Isn't it a funny world? Good-bye, Uncle. I'm going to see that chairman."
And humming a cheery opera air, she departed to her room to dress for going out. Before she did that, however, she took out her notebook and was soon deep in its contents, marking, dashing, erasing, figuring, and talking to herself.
"Free! I wonder what Dilworthy does think of me, anyway. 1, 2, 8, 17, 21. It takes a heap for a majority. Wouldn't Dilworthy open his eyes if he knew some of the things Balloon did say to me? There, Hopperson's influence ought to count 20. The sanctimonious old curmudgeon. Son-in-law, sinecure in the Negro Institution. That about gauges him. The 3 committee-men, sons-in-law. Nothing like a son-in-law here in Washington, or a brother-in-law. And everybody has 'em. Let's see, 61, with places, 25, persuaded, it is getting on. We'll have 2/3 of Congress in time. Dilworthy must surely know I understand him. Uncle Dilworthy, Uncle Balloon, tells very amusing stories, when ladies are not present. I should think so. 85. There, I must find that chairman. Queer. Buckstone acts. Seems to be in love. I was sure of it. He promised to come here, and he hasn't. Strange, very strange. I must chance to meet him today. Laura dressed and went out,
thinking she was perhaps too early for Mr. Buckstone to come from the house, but as he lodged near the bookstore she would drop in there and keep a lookout for him. While Laura is on her errand to find Mr. Buckstone, it may not be out of the way to remark that she knew quite as much of Washington life as Senator Dilworthy gave her credit for, and more than she thought proper to tell him. She was acquainted by this time with a good many of the young fellows of Newspaper Row, and exchanged gossip with them to their mutual advantage. They were always talking in the Row, everlastingly gossiping, bantering and sarcastically praising things, and going on in a style which was a curious commingling of earnest and persiflage. Colonel Sellers liked this talk amazingly, though he was sometimes a little at sea in it, and perhaps that didn't lessen the relish of the conversation to the correspondents. It seems that they had got hold of the dry-goods box packing story about Balloon one day, and were talking it over when the Colonel came in. The Colonel wanted to know all about it, and Hicks told him, and then Hicks went on with a serious air, "Colonel, if you register a letter, it means that it is of value, doesn't it? And if you pay 15 cents for registering it, the government will have to take extra care of it and even pay you back its full value if it is lost. Isn't that so?"
"Yes, I suppose it's so."
Well, Senator Balloon put 15 cents worth of stamps on each of those 7 huge boxes of old clothes, and shipped that ton of second-hand rubbish, old boots and pantaloons and what-not, through the mails as registered matter. It was an ingenious thing, and it had a genuine touch of humor about it, too. I think there is more real talent among our public men of today than there was among those of old times, a far more fertile fancy, a much happier ingenuity. Now, Colonel, can you picture Jefferson or Washington or John Adams franking their wardrobes through the mails and adding the facetious idea of making the government responsible for the cargo for the sum of $1.05? Statesmen were dull creatures in those days. I have a much greater admiration for Senator Balloon.
Yes, Balloon is a man of parts, there is no denying it.
I think so. He is spoken of for the post of Minister to China or Austria, and I hope he will be appointed. What we want abroad is good examples of the national character. John Jay and Benjamin Franklin were well enough in their day, but the nation has made progress since then. Balloon is a man we know and can depend on to be true to himself.
Yes, and Balloon has had a good deal of public experience. He is an old friend of mine. He was governor of one of the territories a while, and was very satisfactory.
Indeed he was. He was ex officio Indian agent, too. Many a man would have taken the Indian appropriation and devoted the money to feeding and clothing the helpless savages whose land had been taken from them by the white man in the interests of civilization. But Balloon knew their needs better. He built a government sawmill on the reservation with the money, and the lumber sold for enormous prices. A relative of his did all the work free of charge.
That is to say, he charged nothing more than the lumber would bring.
But the poor Injuns, not that I care much for Injuns, what did he do for them?
Gave them the outside slabs to fence in the reservation with. Governor Balloon was nothing less than a father to the poor Indians. But Balloon is not alone. We have many truly noble statesmen in our country's service like Balloon. The Senate is full of them. Don't you think so, Colonel?
Well, I don't know. I honor my country's public servants as much as anyone can. I meet them, sir, every day, and the more I see of them, the more I esteem them, and the more grateful I am that our institutions give us the opportunity of securing their services. Few lands are so blessed.
Well, that is true, Colonel. To be sure, you can buy now and then a senator or a representative, but they do not know it is wrong, and so they are not ashamed of it. They are gentle and confiding and childlike, and in my opinion these are qualities that ennoble them far more than any amount of sinful sagacity could. I quite agree with you, Colonel Sellers.
Well, hesitated the Colonel, I am afraid some of them do buy their seats. Yes, I am afraid they do. But as Senator Dilworthy himself said to me, it is sinful. It is very wrong. It is shameful. Heaven protect me from such a charge. That is what Dilworthy said. And yet, when you come to look at it,
You cannot deny that we would have to go without the services of some of our ablest men, sir, if the country were opposed to bribery. It is a harsh term. I do not like to use it."
The colonel interrupted himself at this point to meet an engagement with the Austrian minister, and took his leave with his usual courtly bow. End of chapter 35. This is section 36 of The Gilded Age. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Gilded Age, A Tale of Today, by Mark Twain and C.D. Warner. Chapter 36. In due time Laura alighted at the bookstore and began to look at the titles of the handsome array of books on the counter. A dapper clerk of perhaps 19 or 20 years, with hair accurately parted and surprisingly slick, came bustling up and leaned over with a pretty smile and an affable, "Was there any particular book you wished to see?"
"Have you Taine's England?"
"Beg pardon?"
"Taine's Notes on England."
The young gentleman scratched the side of his nose with a cedar pencil, which he took down from its bracket on the side of his head, and reflected a moment.
"Ah, I see," with a bright smile. "Train, you mean, not Taine. George Francis Train. No, ma'am,
"I mean Taine, if I may take the liberty."
The clerk reflected again. Then,
Taine.
"Is it hymns?"
"No, it isn't hymns. It is a volume that is making a deal of talk just now, and is very widely known, except among parties who sell it."
The clerk glanced at her face to see if a sarcasm might not lurk somewhere in that obscure speech, but the gentle simplicity of the beautiful eyes that met his banished that suspicion. He went away and conferred with the proprietor. Both appeared to be nonplussed. They thought and talked, and talked and thought by turns. Then both came forward, and the proprietor said,
"Is it an American book, ma'am?"
"No, it is an American reprint of an English translation."
"Oh, yes, I remember now. We are expecting it every day. It isn't out yet."
"I think you must be mistaken, because you advertised it a week ago."
"Why, no. Can that be so?"
"Yes, I am sure of it. And besides, here is the book itself on the counter."
She bought it, and the proprietor retired from the field. Then she asked the clerk for the autocrat of the breakfast table, and was pained to see the admiration her beauty had inspired in him fade out of his face. He said with cold dignity that cook-books were somewhat out of their line, but he would order it if she desired it. She said no, never mind. Then she fell to conning the titles again, finding a delight in the inspection of the Hawthornes, the Longfellows, the Tennysons, and other favorites of her idle hours. Meantime the clerk's eyes were busy, and no doubt his admiration was returning again, or maybe he was only gauging her probable literary tastes by some sagacious system of admeasurement only known to his guild. Now he began to assist her in making a selection, but his efforts met with no success. Indeed, they only annoyed her and unpleasantly interrupted her meditations. Presently, while she was holding a copy of Venetian Life in her hand, and running over a familiar passage here and there, the clerk said briskly, snatching up a paper-covered volume and striking the counter a smart blow with it to dislodge the dust, "Now here's a work that we've sold a lot of. Everybody that's read it likes it," and he intruded it under her nose. "It's a book that I can recommend, The Pirate's Doom, or The Last of the Buccaneers. I think it's one of the best things that's come out this season." Laura pushed it gently aside with her hand, and went on filching from Venetian Life.
"I believe I do not want it," she said.
The clerk hunted around a while, glancing at one title and then another, but apparently not finding what he wanted. However, he succeeded at last. Said he,
"Have you ever read this, ma'am? I am sure you'll like it. It's by the author of The Hooligans of Hackensack. It is full of love troubles and mysteries and all sorts of such things. The heroine strangles her own mother. Just glance at the title, please. Gonderil the Vampire, or The Dance of Death. And here is the jockist's own treasury, or The Funny Fellow's Bosom Friend.
The funniest thing! I've read it 4 times, ma'am, and I can laugh at the very sight of it yet. And Gonderil, I assure you it is the most splendid book I ever read. I know you will like these books, ma'am, because I've read them myself and I know what they are." "Oh, I was perplexed, but I see how it is now. You must have thought I asked you to tell me what sort of books I wanted, for I am apt to say things which I don't really mean when I am absent-minded. I suppose I did ask you, didn't I?"
"No, ma'am, but I—"
"Yes, I must have done it, else you would not have offered your services, for fear it might be rude. But don't be troubled, it was all my fault. I ought not to have been so heedless. I ought not to have asked you."
"But you didn't ask me, ma'am. We always help customers all we can. You see, our experience, living right among books all the time, that sort of thing makes us able to help a customer make a selection, you know."
"Now, does it indeed? Is it part of your business, then?"
"Yes'm. We always help."
"How good it is of you! Some people would think it rather obtrusive, perhaps, but I don't. I think it is real kindness, even charity. Some people jump to conclusions without any thought. You have noticed that?"
"Oh, yes," said the clerk, a little perplexed as to whether to feel comfortable or the reverse. "Oh, yes, indeed. I've often noticed that, ma'am."
"Yes, they jump to conclusions with an absurd heedlessness. Now some people would think it odd that because you, with the budding tastes and the innocent enthusiasms natural to your time of life, enjoyed the vampires and the volume of nursery jokes, you should imagine that an older person would delight in them too. But I do not think it odd at all. I think it natural, perfectly natural in you, and kind too. You look like a person who not only finds a deep pleasure in any little thing in the way of literature that strikes you forcibly, but is willing and glad to share that pleasure with others, and that, I think, is noble and admirable, very noble and admirable. I think we ought all to share our pleasures with others, and do what we can to make each other happy. Do not you?"
"Oh, yes. Oh, yes, indeed. Yes, you are quite right, ma'am." But he was getting unmistakably uncomfortable now, notwithstanding Laura's confiding sociability and almost affectionate tone.
"Yes, indeed. Many people would think that what a bookseller, or perhaps his clerk, knows about literature as literature, in contradistinction to its character as merchandise, would hardly be of much assistance to a person, that is to an adult, of course, in the selection of food for the mind, except, of course, wrapping paper, or twine, or wafers, or something like that. But I never feel that way. I feel that whatever service you offer me you offer with a good heart, and I am as grateful for it as if it were the greatest boon to me. And it is useful to me. It is bound to be so. It cannot be otherwise. If you show me a book which you have read, not skimmed over or merely glanced at, but read, and you tell me that you enjoyed it, and that you could read it 3 or 4 times, then I know what book I want."
"Thank you. The
"To avoid—" "Yes, indeed. I think that no information ever comes amiss in this world. Once or twice I have traveled in the cars, and there, you know, the peanut boy always measures you with his eye, and hands you out a book of murders if you are fond of theology, or Tupper, or a dictionary, or T.S. Arthur if you are fond of poetry, or he hands you a volume of distressing jokes or a copy of the American Miscellany if you particularly dislike that sort of literary fatty degeneration of the heart, just for the world like a pleasant-spoken, well-meaning gentleman in any bookstore. But here I am running on as if business men had nothing to do but listen to women talk. You must pardon me, for I was not thinking, and you must let me thank you again for your helping me. I read a good deal, and shall be in nearly every day, and I would be sorry to have you think me a customer who talks too much and buys too little. Might I ask you to give me the time? 2:22. Thank you very much. I will set mine while I have the opportunity."
But she could not get her watch open, apparently. She tried and tried again. Then the clerk, trembling at his own audacity, begged to be allowed to assist. She allowed him. He succeeded, and was radiant under the sweet influences of her pleased face and her seductively worded acknowledgments with gratification.
Then he gave her the exact time again, and anxiously watched her turn the hands slowly till they reached the precise spot without accident or loss of life, and then he looked as happy as a man who had helped a fellow being through a momentous undertaking, and was grateful to know that he had not lived in vain. Laura thanked him once more. The words were music to his ear, but what were they compared to the ravishing smile with which she flooded his whole system? When she bowed her adieu and turned away, he was no longer suffering torture in the pillory where she had had him trussed up during so many distressing moments, but he belonged to the list of her conquests, and was a flattered and happy thrall, with the dawn light of love breaking over the eastern elevations of his heart. It was about the hour now for the chairman of the House Committee on Benevolent Appropriations to make his appearance, and Laura stepped to the door to reconnoiter. She glanced up the street, and sure enough. End of chapter 36. This is section 37 of The Gilded Age. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Gilded Age, A Tale of Today by Mark Twain and C.D. Warner, Chapter 37. That chairman was nowhere in sight. Such disappointments seldom occur in novels, but are always happening in real life. She was obliged to make a new plan. She sent him a note, and asked him to call in the evening, which he did. She received the Honorable Mr. Buckstone with a sunny smile, and said,
"I don't know how I ever dared to send you a note, Mr. Buckstone, for you have the reputation of not being very partial to our sex."
"Why, I am sure my reputation does me wrong, then, Miss Hawkins. I have been married once. Is that nothing in my favor?"
"Oh, yes. That is, it may be and it may not be. If you have known what perfection is in woman, it is fair to argue that inferiority cannot interest you now."
"Well, even if that were the case, it could not affect you, Miss Hawkins," said the chairman gallantly. "Fame does not place you in the list of ladies who rank below perfection." This happy speech delighted Mr. Buckstone as much as it seemed to delight Laura, but it did not confuse him as much as it apparently did her.
"I wish in all sincerity that I could be worthy of such a felicitous compliment as that. But I am a woman, and so I am gratified for it just as it is, and would not have it altered."
"But it is not merely a compliment. That is an empty compliment. It is the truth. All men will endorse that."
Laura looked pleased, and said, "It is very kind of you to say it. It is a distinction indeed for a country-bred girl like me to be so spoken of by people of brains and culture. You are so kind that I know you will pardon my putting you to the trouble to come this evening."
"Indeed, it was no trouble. It was a pleasure. I am alone in the world since I lost my wife, and I often long for the society of your sex, Miss Hawkins, notwithstanding what people may say to the contrary."
"It is pleasant to hear you say that. I am sure it must be so. If I feel lonely at times because of my exile from old friends, although surrounded by new ones who are already very dear to me, how much more lonely must you feel, bereft as you are, and with no wholesome relief from the cares of state that weigh you down. For your own sake, as well as for the sake of others, you ought to go into society oftener. I seldom see you at a reception, and when I do, you do not usually give me very much of your attention."
"I never imagined that you wished it, or I would have been very glad to make myself happy in that way. But one seldom gets an opportunity to say more than a sentence to you in a place like that. You are always the center of a group, a fact which you may have noticed yourself. But if one might come here—"
"Indeed, you would always find a hearty welcome, Mr. Buckstone. I have often wished you would come and tell me more about Cairo and the pyramids, as you once promised me you would."
"Why, do you remember that yet, Miss Hawkins? I thought ladies' memories were more fickle than that."
"Oh, they are not so fickle as gentlemen's promises. And besides, if I had been inclined to forget, Did you not give me something by the way of a remembrancer?"
"Did I?"
"Think."
"It does seem to me that I did, but I have forgotten what it was now."
"Never, never call a lady's memory fickle again. Do you recognize this?"
"A little spray of box. I am beaten. I surrender. But have you kept that all this time?"
Laura's confusion was very pretty. She tried to hide it, But the more she tried, the more manifest it became, and withal the more captivating to look upon. Presently she threw the spray of box from her with an annoyed air, and said, "I forgot myself. I have been very foolish. I beg that you will forget this absurd thing." Mr. Buckstone picked up the spray, and sitting down by Laura's side on the sofa, said, "Please, let me keep it, Miss Hawkins. I set a very high value upon it now."
Give it back to me, Mr. Buckstone, and do not speak so. I have been sufficiently punished for my thoughtlessness. You cannot take pleasure in adding to my distress. Please give it to me."
"Indeed, I do not wish to distress you, but do not consider the matter so gravely. You have done yourself no wrong. You probably forgot that you had it, but if you had given it to me I would have kept it, and not forgotten it."
"Do not talk so, Mr. Buckstone. Give it to me, please, and forget the matter."
"It would not be kind to refuse, since it troubles you so, and so I restore it. But if you would give me part of it and keep the rest—"
"So that you might have something to remind you of me when you wished to laugh at my foolishness?"
"Oh, by no means, no. Simply that I might remember that I had once assisted to discomfort you, and be reminded to do so no more." Laura looked up and scanned his face a moment. She was about to break the twig, but she hesitated and said,
"If I were sure that you—"
She threw the spray away and continued,
"This is silly. We will change the subject. No, do not insist. I must have my way in this."
Then Mr. Buckstone drew off his forces and proceeded to make a wily advance upon the fortress under cover of carefully contrived artifices and stratagems of war. But he contended with an alert and suspicious enemy, and so at the end of 2 hours it was manifest to him that he had made but little progress. Still, he had made some, he was sure of that. Laura sat alone and communed with herself.
"He is fairly hooked, poor thing. I can play him at my leisure and land him when I choose. He was all ready to be caught days and days ago. I saw that very well. He will vote for our bill, no fear about that, and moreover he will work for it, too, before I am done with him. If he had a woman's eyes, he would have noticed that the spray of box had grown 3 inches since he first gave it to me. But a man never sees anything and never suspects. If I had shown him a whole bush, he would have thought it was the same. Well, it is a good night's work. The committee is safe. But this is a desperate game I am playing in these days, a wearing, sordid, heartless game. If I lose everything, even myself. And if I win the game, will it be worth its cost, after all? I do not know. Sometimes I doubt. Sometimes I half wish I had not begun. But no matter. I have begun, and I will never turn back, never while I live." Mr. Buckstone indulged in a reverie as he walked homeward. "She is shrewd and deep, and plays her cards with considerable discretion. But she will lose for all that. There is no hurry. I shall come out winner, all in good time. She is the most beautiful woman in the world, and she surpassed herself tonight. I suppose I must vote for that bill in the end, maybe, but that is not a matter of much consequence. The government can stand it. She is bent on capturing me, that is plain, but she will find by and by that what she took for a sleeping garrison was an ambuscade." End of chapter 37. This is section 38 of The Gilded Age. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Gilded Age, A Tale of Today by Mark Twain and C.D. Warner, Chapter 38. Now this surprising news caused her fall in a trance. Life as she were dead, no limbs she could advance. Then her dear brother came, her from the ground he took, and she spake up, and said, "Oh, my poor heart is broke." The Barncastle Tragedy. "Don't you think he is distinguished-looking?"
"What, that gawky-looking person with Miss Hawkins?"
"There, he's just speaking to Mrs. Shoemaker. Such high-bred negligence and unconsciousness. Nothing studied. See his fine eyes."
"Very. They are moving this way now. Maybe he is coming here. But he looks as helpless as a rag baby. Who is he, Blanche?"
"Who is he? And you've been here a week, Grace, and don't know? He's the catch of the season. That's Washington Hawkins, her brother."
"No, is it?"
"Very old family. Old Kentucky family, I believe. He's got enormous landed property in Tennessee, I think. The family lost everything, slaves and that sort of thing, you know, in the war. But they have a great deal of land, minerals, mines, and all that. Mr. Hawkins and his sister, too, are very much interested in the amelioration of the condition of the colored race. They have some plans, with Senator Dilworthy, to convert a large part of their property to something another for the freedmen."
"You don't say so. I thought he was some guy from Pennsylvania."
"But he is different from others. Probably he has lived all his life on his plantation." It was a day reception of Mrs. Representative Schoonmaker, a sweet woman, of simple and sincere manners. Her house was one of the most popular in Washington. There was less ostentation than there in some others, and people liked to go where the atmosphere reminded them of the peace and purity of home. Mrs. Schoonmaker was as natural and unaffected in Washington society as she was in her own New York house, and kept up the spirit of home life there with her husband and children. And that was the reason, probably, why people of refinement liked to go there. Washington is a microcosm, and one can suit himself with any sort of society within a radius of a mile. To a large portion of the people who frequent Washington or dwell there, the ultra-fashion, the shoddy, the jobbery, are as utterly distasteful as they would be in a refined New England city. Schoonmaker was not exactly a leader in the house, but he was greatly respected for his fine talents and his honesty. No one would have thought of offering to carry National Improvement Director's relief stock for him. These day receptions were attended by more women than men, and those interested in the problem might have studied the costumes of the ladies present, in view of this fact, to discover whether women dress more for the eyes of women or for effect upon men. It is a very important problem, and has been a good deal discussed, and its solution would form one fixed philosophical basis upon which to estimate woman's character. We are inclined to take a medium ground, and aver that woman dresses to please herself, and in obedience to a law of her own nature. "They are coming this way,"
said Blanche. People who made way for them to pass turned to look at them. Washington began to feel that the eyes of the public were on him also, and his eyes rolled about, now towards the ceiling, now towards the floor, in an effort to look unconscious.
"Good morning, Miss Hawkins. Delighted. Mr. Hawkins, my friend Miss Medlar."
Mr. Hawkins, who was endeavoring to square himself for a bow, put his foot through the train of Mrs. Senator Poplin, who looked round with a scowl, which turned into a smile as she saw who it was. In extricating himself, Mr. Hawkins, who had the care of his hat as well as the introduction on his mind, shambled against Miss Blanche, who said pardon with the prettiest accent, as if the awkwardness were her own, and Mr. Hawkins righted himself.
"Don't you find it very warm today, Mr. Hawkins?"
said Blanche, by way of a remark.
"It's awfully hot," said Washington.
"It's warm for the season," continued Blanche pleasantly, "but I suppose you are accustomed to it," she added, with a general idea that the thermometer always stands at 90 degrees in all parts of the late slave states. "Washington weather generally cannot be very congenial to you."
"It's congenial," said Washington, brightening up, "when it's not congealed."
"That's very good. Did you hear, Grace? Mr. Hawkins says it's congenial when it's not congealed." "What is, dear?" said Grace, who was talking with Laura. The conversation was now finally under way. Washington launched out an observation of his own. "Did you see those Japs, Miss Levitt?" "Oh, yes, aren't they queer? But so high-bred, so picturesque. Do you think that color makes any difference, Mr. Hawkins? I used to be so prejudiced against color."
"Did you? I never was. I used to think my old mammy was handsome."
"How interesting your life must have been. I should like to hear about it."
Washington was about settling himself into his narrative style when Mrs. General McFingal caught his eye.
"Have you been at the Capitol today, Mr. Hawkins?"
Washington had not. "Is anything uncommon going on?"
"They say it was very exciting. The Alabama business, you know. General Sutler of Massachusetts defied England, and they say he wants war."
"He wants to make himself conspicuous, more like," said Laura. "He always, you have noticed, talks with one eye on the gallery while the other is on the speaker."
"Well, my husband says it's nonsense to talk of war, and wicked. He knows what war is. If we do have war, I hope it will be for the patriots of Cuba. Don't you think we want Cuba, Mr. Hawkins?"
"I think we want it bad," said Washington. "And Santo Domingo. Senator Dilworthy says we are bound to extend our religion over the isles of the sea. We've got to round out our territory, and—" Washington's further observations were broken off by Laura, who whisked him off to another part of the room, and reminded him that they must make their adieu.
"How stupid and tiresome these people are," she said. "Let's go."
They were turning to say good-bye to the hostess when Laura's attention was arrested by the sight of a gentleman who was just speaking to Mrs. Schoonmaker. For a second her heart stopped beating. He was a handsome man of 40, and perhaps more, with grayish hair and whiskers, and he walked with a cane, as if he were slightly lame. He might be less than 40, for his face was worn into hard lines, and he was pale. "No, it could not be," she said to herself. "It is only a resemblance." But as the gentleman turned and she saw his full face, Laura put out her hand and clutched Washington's arm to prevent herself from falling. Washington, who was not minding anything, as usual, looked round in wonder. Laura's eyes were blazing fire and hatred. He had never seen her look so before, and her face was livid. "Why, what is it, sis? Your face is as white as paper."
"It's he. Come, come." She dragged him away.
"It's who?" asked Washington, when they had gained the carriage.
"It's nobody. It's nothing. Did I say he? I was faint with the heat. Don't mention it. Don't you speak of it," she added earnestly, grasping his arm.
When she had gained her room she went to the glass and saw a pallid and haggard face.
"My God!" she cried, "this will never do. I should have killed him if I could. The scoundrel still lives and dares to come here. I ought to kill him. He has no right to live. How I hate him! And yet I loved him. Oh, heavens, how I did love that man! And why didn't he kill me? He might better. He did kill all that was good in me. Oh, but he shall not escape. He shall not escape this time. He may have forgotten. He will find that a woman's hate doesn't forget. The law? What would the law do but protect him and make me an outcast? How all Washington would gather up its virtuous skirts and avoid me if it knew. I wonder if he hates me as I do him." So Laura raved, in tears and in rage by turns, tossed in a tumult of passion which she gave way to with little effort to control. A servant came to summon her to dinner. She had a headache. The hour came for the President's reception. She had a raving headache, and the Senator must go without her. That night of agony was like another night she recalled. How vividly it all came back to her, and at that time she remembered she thought she might be mistaken. He might come back to her. Perhaps he loved her a little, after all. Now she knew he did not. Now she knew he was a cold-blooded scoundrel without pity. Never a word in all these years. She had hoped he was dead. Did his wife live, she wondered? She caught at that, and it gave a new current to her thoughts. Perhaps, after all, she must see him. She could not live without seeing him. Would he smile as in the old days when she loved him so? Or would he sneer as when she last saw him? If he looked so, she hated him. If he should call her Laura darling and look so, she must find him. She must end her doubts. Laura kept her room for 2 days, on one excuse and another, a nervous headache, a cold, to the great anxiety of the Senator's household. Callers, who went away, said she had been too gay. They did not say fast, though some of them may have thought it. One so conspicuous and successful in society as Laura could not be out of the way 2 days without remarks being made, and not all of them complimentary. When she came down she appeared as usual, a little pale maybe, but unchanged in manner. If there were any deepened lines about the eyes they had been concealed. Her course of action was quite determined.
At breakfast she asked if anyone had heard any unusual noise during the night. Nobody had. Washington never heard any noise of any kind after his eyes were shut. Some people thought he never did when they were open either. Senator Dilworthy said he had come in late. He was detained in a little consultation after the congressional prayer meeting. Perhaps it was his entrance. No, Laura said. She heard that. It was later. She might have been nervous, but she fancied somebody was trying to get into the house. Mr. Brierly humorously suggested that it might be, as none of the members were occupied in night session. The senator frowned and said he did not like to hear that kind of newspaper slang. There might be burglars about. Laura said that very likely it was only her nervousness, but she thought she would feel safer if Washington would let her take one of his pistols. Washington brought her one of his revolvers and instructed her in the art of loading and firing it. During the morning, Laura drove down to Mrs. Schoonmaker's to pay a friendly call.
"Your receptions are always delightful," she said to that lady. "The pleasant people all seem to come here."
"It's pleasant to hear you say so, Miss Hawkins. I believe my friends like to come here, though society in Washington is mixed. We have a little of everything."
"I suppose, though, you don't see much of the old rebel element," said Laura with a smile.
If this seemed to Mrs. Schoonmaker a singular remark for a lady to make, who was meeting rebels in society every day, she did not express it in any way, but only said,
"You know, we don't say rebel any more. Before we came to Washington I thought rebels would look unlike other people. I find we are very much alike, and that kindness and good nature wear away prejudice. And then, you know, there are all sorts of common interests. My husband sometimes says that he doesn't see but Confederates are just as eager to get at the Treasury as Unionists. You know that Mr. Schoonmaker is on the appropriations. Does he know many Southerners?" "Oh, yes. There were several at my reception the other day. Among others, a Confederate colonel, a stranger, handsome man with gray hair, probably you didn't notice him, uses a cane in walking. A very agreeable man. I wondered why he called. When my husband came home and looked over the cards, he said he had a cotton claim. A real Southerner. Perhaps you might know him if I could think of his name. Yes, here's his card, Louisiana."
Laura took the card, looked at it intently till she was sure of the address, and then laid it down with,
"No, he is no friend of ours."
That afternoon Laura wrote and dispatched the following note. It was in a round hand, unlike her flowing style, and it was directed to a number and street in Georgetown. A lady at Senator Dilworthy's would like to see Colonel George Selby on business connected with the cotton claims. Can he call Wednesday at 3:00 p.m.? On Wednesday at 3 p.m. no one of the family was likely to be in the house except Laura. End of chapter 38. This is section 39 of The Gilded Age. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Gilded Age, A Tale of Today, by Mark Twain and C.D. Warner, Chapter 39. Colonel Selby had just come to Washington and taken lodgings in Georgetown. His business was to get pay for some cotton that was destroyed during the war. There were many others in Washington on the same errand, some of them with claims as difficult to establish as his. A concert of action was necessary, and he was not, therefore, at all surprised to receive the note from a lady asking him to call at Senator Dilworthy's. At a little after 3 on Wednesday he rang the bell of the senator's residence. It was a handsome mansion on the square opposite the President's house. The owner must be a man of great wealth, the colonel thought. "Perhaps, who knows," said he with a smile, "he may have got some of my cotton in exchange for salt and quinine after the capture of New Orleans." As this thought passed through his mind he was looking at the remarkable figure of the hero of New Orleans, holding itself by main strength from sliding off the back of the rearing bronze horse, and lifting its hat in the manner of one who acknowledges the playing of that martial air, "See, the conquering hero comes." "Gad," said the colonel to himself, "Old Hickory ought to get down and give his seat to General Sutler, but they'd have to tie him on." Laura was in the drawing-room. She heard the bell, she heard the steps in the hall, and the emphatic thud of the supporting cane. She had risen from her chair and was leaning against the piano, pressing her left hand against the violent beating of her heart. The door opened, and the Colonel entered, standing in the full light of the opposite window. Laura was more in the shadow, and stood for an instant, long enough for the Colonel to make the inward observation that she was a magnificent woman. She then advanced a step.
"Colonel Selby, is it not?"
The Colonel staggered back, caught himself by a chair, and turned toward her a look of terror. "Laura? My God!"
"Yes, your wife."
"Oh, no, it can't be."
"How came you here? I thought you were—" "You thought I was dead? You thought you were rid of me? Not so long as you live, Colonel Selby, not so long as you live,"
Laura in her passion was hurried on to say. No man had ever accused Colonel Selby of cowardice, but he was a coward before this woman. Maybe he was not the man he once was. Where was his coolness? Where was his sneering, imperturbable manner with which he could have met, and would have met, any woman he had wronged, if he had only been forewarned? He felt now that he must temporize, that he must gain time. There was danger in Laura's tone. There was something frightful in her calmness. Her steady eyes seemed to devour him.
"You have ruined my life," she said, "and I was so young, so ignorant, and loved you so. You betrayed me and left me, mocking me and trampling me into the dust, a soiled cast-off. You might better have killed me then. Then I should not have hated you."
"Laura," said the Colonel, nerving himself, but still pale, and speaking appealingly, "don't say that. Reproach me. I deserve it. I was a scoundrel. I was everything monstrous. But your beauty made me crazy. You are right. I was a brute in leaving you as I did. But what could I do? I was married, and—"
"And your wife still lives?"
asked Laura, bending a little forward in her eagerness. The Colonel noticed the action, and he almost said no, but he thought of the folly of attempting concealment. "Yes, she is here." What little color had wandered back into Laura's face forsook it again. Her heart stood still. Her strength seemed going from her limbs. Her last hope was gone. The room swam before her for a moment, and the Colonel stepped towards her, but she waved him back, as hot anger again coursed through her veins, and said,
"And you dare come with her here, and tell me of it, here, and mock me with it, and you think I will have it, George? You think I will let you live with that woman? You think I am as powerless as that day I fell dead at your feet?" She raged now. She was in a tempest of excitement, and she advanced towards him with a threatening mien. She would kill him if she could, thought the Colonel, but he thought at the same moment how beautiful she is. He had recovered his head now. She was lovely when he knew her, then a simple country girl. Now she was dazzling, in the fullness of her ripe womanhood, a superb creature, with all the fascination that a woman of the world has for such a man as Colonel Selby. Nothing of this was lost on him. He stepped quickly to her, grasped both her hands in his, and said, "Laura, stop. Think. Suppose I loved you yet. Suppose I hated my fate. What can I do? I am broken by the war. I have lost everything almost. I had as lief be dead and done with it." The Colonel spoke with a low, remembered voice that thrilled through Laura. He was looking into her eyes as he had looked in those old days, when no birds of all those that sang in the groves where they walked sang a note of warning. He was wounded. He had been punished. Her strength forsook her with her rage, and she sank upon a chair, sobbing. "Oh, my God, I thought I hated him." The Colonel knelt beside her. He took her hand, and she let him keep it. She looked down into his face with a pitiable tenderness, and said in a weak voice, "And do you love me a little?" The Colonel vowed and protested. He kissed her hand and her lips. He swore his false soul into perdition. She wanted love, this woman. Was not her love for George Selby deeper than any other woman's could be? Had she not a right to him? Did he not belong to her by virtue of her overmastering passion? His wife. She was not his wife, except by the law. She could not be. Even with the law, she could have no right to stand between two souls that were one. It was an infamous condition in society that George should be tied to her. Laura thought this, believed it, because she desired to believe it.
She came to it as an original proposition, founded on the requirements of her own nature. She may have heard, doubtless she had, similar theories that were prevalent at that day, theories of the tyranny of marriage and of the freedom of marriage. She had even heard women lecturers say that marriage should only continue so long as it pleased either party to it, for a year or a month or a day. She had not given much heed to this, but she saw its justice now in a dash of revealing desire. It must be right. God would not have permitted her to love George Selby as she did, and him to love her, if it was right for society to raise up a barrier between them. He belonged to her. Had he not confessed it himself? Not even the religious atmosphere of Senator Dilworthy's house had been sufficient to instill into Laura that deep Christian principle which had been somehow omitted in her training. Indeed, in that very house had she not heard women, prominent before the country and besieging Congress, utter sentiments that fully justified the course she was marking out for herself? They were seated now, side by side, talking with more calmness. Laura was happy, or thought she was, but it was that feverish sort of happiness which is snatched out of the black shadow of falsehood, and is at the moment recognized as fleeting and perilous, and indulged tremblingly. She loved, she was loved. That is happiness, certainly. And the black past, and the troubled present, and the uncertain future could not snatch that from her. What did they say as they sat there? What nothings do people usually say in such circumstances, even if they are 70. It was enough for Laura to hear his voice and be near him. It was enough for him to be near her, and avoid committing himself as much as he could. Enough for him was the present also. Had there not always been some way out of such scrapes? And yet Laura could not be quite content without prying into tomorrow. How could the Colonel manage to free himself from his wife? Would it be long? Could he not go into some state where it would not take much time? He could not say exactly. That they must think of. That they must talk over, and so on. Did this seem like a damnable plot to Laura against the life, maybe, of a sister, a woman like herself? Probably not. It was right that this man should be hers, and there were some obstacles in the way, that was all. There are as good reasons for bad actions as for good ones, to those who commit them. When one has broken the 10th commandment, the others are not of much account. Was it unnatural, therefore, that when George Selby departed, Laura should watch him from the window with an almost joyful heart as he went down the sunny square?
"I shall see him tomorrow," she said, "and the next day, and the next. He is mine now."
"Damn the woman," said the Colonel as he picked his way down the steps. "Or," he added, as his thoughts took a new turn, "I wish my wife was in New Orleans." End of chapter 39. This is section 40 of The Gilded Age. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Gilded Age, A Tale of Today, by Mark Twain and C.D. Warner. Chapter 40. Open your ears! For which of you will stop the vent of hearing when loud rumor speaks? I, from the Orient to the drooping West, making the wind my post-horse, still unfold the acts commenced on this ball of earth. Upon my tongue's continual slanders ride, the which in every language I pronounce, stuffing the ears of men with false reports. King Henry IV. As may be readily believed, Colonel Beriah Sellers was by this time one of the best-known men in Washington. For the first time in his life his talents had a fair field. He was now at the center of the manufacture of gigantic schemes, of speculations of all sorts, of political and social gossip. The atmosphere was full of little and big rumors and of vast, undefined expectations. Everybody was in haste, too, to push on his private plan, and feverish in his haste, as if in constant apprehension that tomorrow would be Judgment Day. Work while Congress is in session, said the uneasy spirit, for in the recess there is no work and no device. The Colonel enjoyed this bustle and confusion amazingly. He thrived in the air of indefinite expectation. All his own schemes took larger shape and more misty and majestic proportions, and in this congenial air the Colonel seemed even to himself to expand into something large and mysterious. If he respected himself before, he almost worshipped Beriah Sellers now as a superior being. If he could have chosen an official position out of the highest, he would have been embarrassed in the selection. The presidency of the Republic seemed too limited and cramped in the constitutional restrictions. If he could have been Grand Lama of the United States, that might have come to the nearest to his idea of a position. And next to that he would have luxuriated in the irresponsible omniscience of the special correspondent. Colonel Sellers knew the President very well, and had access to his presence when officials were kept cooling their heels in the waiting-room. The President liked to hear the Colonel talk. His voluble ease was a refreshment after the decorous dullness of men who only talked business and government, and everlastingly expounded their notions of justice and the distribution of patronage. The Colonel was as much a lover of farming and of horses as Thomas Jefferson was. He talked to the President by the hour about his magnificent stud and his plantation at Hawkeye, a kind of principality he represented it. He urged the President to pay him a visit during the recess and see his stock farm. "The President's table is well enough," he used to say to the loafers who gathered about him at Willard's, "well enough for a man on a salary, but God bless my soul, I should like him to see a little old-fashioned hospitality, open house, you know. A person seeing me at home might think I paid no attention to what was in the house, just let things flow in and out. He'd be mistaken. What I look to is quality, sir. The President has variety enough, but the quality. Vegetables, of course, you can't expect here. I'm very particular about mine. Take celery, now. There's only one spot in this country where celery will grow. But I am surprised about the wines. I should think they were manufactured in the New York Custom House. I must send the President some from my cellar. I was really mortified the other day at dinner to see Blake Bay leave his standing in the glasses." When the Colonel first came to Washington, he had thoughts of taking the mission to Constantinople in order to be on the spot to look after the dissemination of his eye-water, but as that invention was not yet quite ready, the project shrank a little in the presence of vaster schemes. Besides, he felt that he could do the country more good by remaining at home. He was one of the Southerners who were constantly quoted as heartily accepting the situation. "I'm whipped," he used to say with a jolly laugh. "The government was too many for me. I'm cleaned out, done for, except my plantation and private mansion. We played for a big thing and lost it, and I don't whine for one. I go for putting the old flag on all the vacant lots. I said to the President, says I, 'Grant, why don't you take Santo Domingo? Annex the whole thing and settle the bill afterwards. That's my way. I'd take the job to manage Congress. The South would come into it. You've got to conciliate the South, consolidate the two debts, pay 'em off in greenbacks, and go ahead. That's my notion. Boutwell's got the right notion about the value of paper, but he lacks courage. I should like to run the Treasury Department about 6 months. I'd make things plenty, and business look up." The Colonel had access to the departments. He knew all the senators and representatives, and especially the lobby. He was consequently a great favorite in Newspaper Row, and was often lounging in the offices there, dropping bits of private official information, which were immediately caught up and telegraphed all over the country. But it used to surprise even the Colonel when he read it. It was embellished to that degree that he hardly recognized it, and the hint was not lost on him. He began to exaggerate his heretofore simple conversations to suit the newspaper demand. People used to wonder in the winters of 1870 and 1870 where the specials got that remarkable information with which they every morning surprised the country, revealing the most secret intentions of the President and his cabinet, the private thoughts of political leaders, the hidden meaning of every movement. This information was furnished by Colonel Sellers. When he was asked afterwards about the stolen copy of the Alabama Treaty which got into the New York Tribune, he only looked mysterious and said that neither he nor Senator Dilworthy knew anything about it, but those whom he was in the habit of meeting occasionally felt almost certain that he did know. It must not be supposed that the Colonel, in his general patriotic labors, neglected his own affairs. The Columbus River navigation scheme absorbed only a part of his time, so he was enabled to throw quite a strong reserve force of energy into the Tennessee land plan, a vast enterprise commensurate with his abilities, and in the prosecution of which he was greatly aided by Mr. Henry Brierly, who was buzzing about the Capitol and the hotels day and night, and making capital for it in some mysterious way.
"We must create a public opinion," said Senator Dilworthy. "My only interest in it is a public one, and if the country wants the institution, Congress will have to yield."
It may have been after a conversation between the Colonel and Senator Dilworthy that the following special despatch was sent to a New York newspaper. We understand that a philanthropic plan is on foot in relation to the colored race that will, if successful, revolutionize the whole character of Southern industry. An experimental institution is in contemplation in Tennessee, which will do for that state what the industrial school at Zurich did for Switzerland. We learn that approaches have been made to the heirs of the late Hon. Silas Hawkins of Missouri in reference to a lease of a portion of their valuable property in East Tennessee. Senator Dilworthy, it is understood, is inflexibly opposed to any arrangement that will not give the government absolute control. Private interests must give way to the public good. It is to be hoped that Colonel Sellers, who represents the heirs, will be led to see the matter in this light. When Washington Hawkins read this despatch, he went to the Colonel in some anxiety. He was for a lease. He didn't want to surrender anything. What did he think the government would offer? 2 millions?
"Maybe 3, maybe 4, said the Colonel. "It's worth more than the Bank of England."
"If they will not lease," said Washington, "let 'em make it 2 millions for an undivided half. I'm not going to throw it away, not the whole of it." Harry told the Colonel that they must drive the thing through. He couldn't be dallying round Washington when spring opened. Phil wanted him. Phil had a great thing on hand up in Pennsylvania.
"What is that?"
inquired the Colonel, always ready to interest himself in anything large. "A mountain of coal, that's all. He's going to run a tunnel into it in the spring."
"Does he want any capital?"
asked the Colonel, in the tone of a man who is given to calculating carefully before he makes an investment. "No. Old man Bolton's behind him. He has capital, but I judged that he wanted my experience in starting."
"Well, if he wants me, tell him I'll come after Congress adjourns. I should like to give him a little lift. He lacks enterprise. Now, about that Columbus River. He doesn't see his chances. But he's a good fellow, and you can tell him that Sellers won't go back on him."
"By the way," asked Harry, "who is that rather handsome party that's hanging round Laura? I see him with her everywhere, at the Capitol, in the horse-cars, and he comes to Dilworthy's. If he weren't lame, I should think he was going to run off with her."
"Oh, well, that's nothing. Laura knows her business. He has a cotton claim. Used to be at Hawkeye during the war. Selby's his name. Was a colonel. Got a wife and family. Very respectable people, the Selbys."
"Well, that's all right," said Harry, "if it's his business. But if a woman looked at me as I've seen her at Selby, I should understand it. And it's talked about, I can tell you." Jealousy had no doubt sharpened this young gentleman's observation. Laura could not have treated him with more lofty condescension if she had been the Queen of Sheba on a royal visit to the great republic. And he resented it, and was huffy when he was with her, and ran her errands, and brought her gossip, and bragged of his intimacy with the lovely creature among the fellows at Newspaper Row. Laura's life was rushing on now in the full stream of intrigue and fashionable dissipation. She was conspicuous at the balls of the fastest set, and was suspected of being present at those doubtful suppers that began late and ended early. If Senator Dilworthy remonstrated about appearances, she had a way of silencing him. Perhaps she had some hold on him. Perhaps she was necessary to his plan for ameliorating the condition of the colored race. She saw Colonel Selby when the public knew and when it did not know. She would see him, whatever excuses he made and however he avoided her. She was urged on by a fever of love and hatred and jealousy which alternately possessed her. Sometimes she petted him and coaxed him and tried all her fascinations, and again she threatened him and reproached him. What was he doing? Why had he taken no steps to free himself? Why didn't he send his wife home? She should have money soon. They could go to Europe, anywhere. What did she care for talk? And he promised, and lied, and invented fresh excuses for delay, like a cowardly gambler and rue as he was, fearing to break with her, and half the time unwilling to give her up. "That woman doesn't know what fear is," he said to himself, "and she watches me like a hawk." He told his wife that this woman was a lobbyist whom he had to tolerate and use in getting through his claims, and that he should pay her and have done with her when he succeeded. End of chapter 40.